4:17 in the afternoon. Inside a black SUV parked along the harbor, a man sat perfectly still, the phone still pressed to his ear. The call was supposed to have ended, it hadn't. Rain slid down the glass in long silver threads. No one in the vehicle dared breathe too loud. Then a woman's voice came through the speaker, sweet as a blade wrapped in silk. "Unless you want your son to disappear from school tomorrow." Blue backpack. Side gate, the hand resting on his knee did not move. But something behind his eyes just did. A yacht bell rang somewhere out in the bay, indifferent. Harbor lights blurred through the fog. The cliffside mansion still glowed amber against a bruised sky, peaceful, as if nothing at all were happening. But underneath all that polish, something had just shifted permanently. The woman wearing his ring had just threatened a 9-year-old boy. And she didn't know she was still being heard. The phone call started at 4:17. Not that anyone was counting. Not yet. Sandro Rocca sat in the back of a black SUV parked along the curve of Halstead Harbor, rain sliding down the window in long silver threads. He was not counting anything. He was listening. There is a difference. Counting is for men who still believe numbers can save them. Listening is for men who already know they can't. His hand rested on his knee. Still, too still. The men up front didn't move either. Nobody breathed too loud when Sandro went quiet like this. Quiet like a held breath. Quiet like a door about to close on someone's fingers. Through the phone's speaker, tinny and thin, came a voice he knew better than his own heartbeat by now. Camille's voice, sweet. Practiced. The kind of sweet you learn in finishing schools and boardrooms. Not in kitchens. "Your mother's resting, darling," she'd told him minutes earlier. "Nora's with her. Everything will be perfect tomorrow night." Then a click, soft. Careless, she thought the call had ended. It hadn't. Sandro heard a door close on the other end, heard silk moving. Heard the low electric hum of his mother's breathing machine, steady, patient, the sound that had filled his childhood home for three years now. And then he heard a second voice. Quiet, firm. "Nora, I won't lie for you." Sandro's eyes lifted. Just his eyes. Nothing else on his face moved. Camille laughed. Not a warm laugh. A blade dressed up as one. "Now you will," she said. That was the exact second the world tilted underneath Sandro Rocca. Though he didn't know it yet. Because she didn't know she was still being heard. Because pride makes people careless. And cruelty makes them worse. Tomorrow night, when Sandro asked for his mother's blessing, Camille said, "You'll tell him Adriana accepts me." Silence. "She doesn't accept me," Camille went on, softer now. Almost amused, "but she can answer. And you're her voice, so you'll make her say yes." Another pause. Longer this time. Sandro could see the room in his mind without ever having to ask. His mother by the tall window overlooking the gray Atlantic. Silver hair pinned low, hands trembling on a writing board. No one else in the world had bothered to learn how to read, and beside her, Nora, standing too still. The way people stand when they're trying not to become a target. Then Camille's the sentence that changed the temperature inside that SUV by 20 degrees. "Unless you want your son to disappear from school tomorrow." One of Sandro's men turned his head, just slightly, waiting to see what happens next when a woman like Camille says a sentence like that to a man like Sandro. Sandro didn't move, which was worse. Camille kept going, voice dropping into something almost tender. "Which made it backpack," she said. Red inhaler clipped to the side pocket. "He waits by the side gate because he likes watching the neighbor's dog through the fence. Children are so easy to find. When their mothers are predictable." There was a sound then. Not a scream. Nora didn't scream. Sandro had noticed that about her before, in small ways, without knowing why he was noticing anything about her at all. She was the kind of woman who swallowed pain before it turned into noise. The kind who'd learned, somewhere along the way, that giving cruel people the satisfaction of watching you break was its own kind of defeat. But he heard her breath catch. Break almost. And something inside Sandro went still in a way that frightened the men beside him. Rage they knew how to survive. This was something else. Camille wasn't finished. "If you expose me," she said, "I'll say you misunderstood Adriana. I'll say you planted fear in her head. I'll say a lonely hired woman wanted to feel important in a house she doesn't belong in." A pause. "Sandro will believe his fiancée before he believes a nanny with bills to pay." "You don't know him," Nora whispered. "No," Camille said, "you don't." Then came a sound Sandro knew instantly. Wood sliding, being Taker's writing board. Camille's voice turned. Naked now, triumphant. "No more little messages," she said. "No more warnings. Tomorrow you sit there. And you let Nora save her son by giving me exactly what silence is." Except this silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something about to break. Then Camille gasped. And a second later Sandro heard her whisper his own name into the phone. Like she'd only just remembered it was still connected. Sandro. He ended the call. The screen went black in his hand. For a long moment nobody in the SUV moved. Outside the harbor lights blurred through rain and fog. Somewhere a yacht bell rang, soft, indifferent. Halstead Bay looked peaceful in weather like this, old money tucked behind iron gates. Cliffside houses glowing gold against a bruised sky. But underneath all that polish, something had just shifted permanently. His fiancée had threatened a 9-year-old boy. His mother had been trapped, voiceless, inside her own home. And Nora Bennett had been standing between the two of them, alone. Sandro handed the phone forward without looking at it. "Vincent," he said. "Calm. Too calm." Stin Elementary Academy, blue backpack. Asthma medication, the side pocket. Vincent's face changed instantly. "Get to the school before Dresmendu," Sandro said. "No scene, no panic. Nobody touches that boy." "Yes, sir." The door was already open before Sandro finished the sentence. He turned to the driver, 2 words, "the house." The SUV pulled away from the curb. Only then did Sandro let himself look at the rain again. His reflection stared back from the dark glass, black suit, dark eyes. A face that gave nothing away, the kind of face that had made men twice his age flinch in boardrooms and back alleys both. But beneath the stillness, something old and brutal had just opened its eyes. He'd built walls around his mother after the attack, guards, cameras. Specialists flown in from 3 states over. He'd believed, foolishly the way rich men always believe, that money could buy a room its safety back. And still, a woman wearing his ring had reached his mother first. Worse. She'd reached her because Sandro had trusted beauty when he should have trusted fear. That mistake was about to cost someone everything. He just didn't know yet whose everything it would be. 6 months earlier, Nora Bennett walked through the servants' gate of the Rocca estate carrying a second-hand purse, tired eyes, and a resume folded too carefully in her hand. She did not look like she belonged there. That was, in fact, the exact reason Sandro remembered her. But to understand what she was walking into, you have to back further than that gate. Further than the mansion, further than any of it. You have to go back to Fallhaven, Massachusetts. To a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where the pipes screamed in winter and the heat came and went depending on whether the landlord felt like being a decent human being that month. Nora grew up there. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night, came home smelling like industrial lemon and exhaustion. Her father left when Nora was 12. Came back twice. Once to ask for money. Once to borrow a car he never returned. You'd think that would break a person early. Make them brittle. Instead it made Nora load-bearing. The kind of person things get built on top of, whether she agrees to it or not. By 25, she'd carved out a small plain, hard-won life. A job at an elder care facility. An apartment shared with her younger sister Dana. An engagement to a man named Ethan, who liked her softness right up until it asked something of him, liked her kindness right up until it became inconvenient. Then Dana died. Wet road outside the city. That fast. She left behind a baby boy with dark hair and lungs too fragile for New England winter. Milo. Everyone had advice for Nora after that. Ethan told her they could help from a distance, which is a phrase people use when they mean not at all. His mother told her that motherhood would ruin her figure, her freedom, her marriage prospects. A social worker asked gently whether she'd considered other family placements. Nora took Milo home anyway. Ethan left within the month. Nora cried exactly once in a bathroom, while Milo spent laundry basket lined with towels because there was no money yet for a crib. Then she washed her face, warmed a bottle, became a mother without asking the world's permission first. After that, love became something Nora measured by what it demanded of her. If a man wanted her but not Milo, he wanted the wrong woman. If a job paid well but treated her like she had no spine, she stayed exactly as long as rent required and then she left. If the world had opinions about her body, her age, her tired eyes, well, let it talk. Milo's inhaler mattered more than strangers' opinions. It wasn't close. The Rocca estate paid better than any care facility in the state, so she took the job. Even though the gates made her nervous. Even though the guards watched a beat too long. Even though something about the whole property felt like holding your breath in a beautiful room. She stayed. Everything. Always for Milo. The first morning Sandro saw her, she was standing outside his mother's bedroom, holding a cup of tea in one hand and a small alphabet board in the other. Nora was soft around the middle. Warm brown eyes that avoided his gaze until she realized avoiding him made her look afraid. Then she forced herself to meet it instead. Most people lowered their heads around Sandro. Nora looked at him like she was frightened, yes, but not empty. His mother sat by the window in a blue shawl, watching them both like she already knew something Sandro didn't. Does she understand my mother? Sandro asked the housekeeper. She says she does. Nora's chin lifted a fraction. I don't say I understand, she corrected, quiet but clear. I say I'm learning how she chooses to speak. The room went silent. A maid stared at the floor. One of the guards shifted his weight, waiting to see if the new hire had just signed her own dismissal on her first morning. Sandro looked at her for a long second. Then his mother tapped twice against the arm of her chair. 2 taps meant yes, that was enough. From that day on, Nora became the only person in the house Adriana consistently let close. Nora learned the language patiently, one silent lesson at a time. 2 taps yes, 1 tap no. A finger pressed to the small silver cross at Adriana's throat. Someone is lying, a closed fist, pain. Eyes shifting to the door, she wants privacy. A slow blink. A hand on the blanket, exhaustion. Please stop asking. Sandro watched Nora learn his mother's language with a patience he did not know still existed inside that mansion. She never rushed Adriana. Never spoke over her, never treated silence as if it meant absence. And Sandro, who had spent his adult life commanding entire rooms with a handful of quiet words, slowly began to understand something uncomfortable. He had failed the one silence that mattered most to him. At first he told himself his attentions toward Nora was practical. His mother trusted her. That made her important, nothing more. Except then he started noticing things he had no logical reason to notice. How Nora wore the same black shoes until the heels gave out. How she brought her own lunch in containers wrapped in rubber bands, because the lids didn't seal anymore. How she smiled at Adriana with a kind of tired tenderness, then lost the smile the second she stepped into the hallway, like it cost too much to keep it on for herself. How she refused gifts from the kitchen staff, unless someone insisted she bring leftovers home for Milo. Nora never talked about herself. But she talked about Milo whenever Adriana asked through the board. Loved ocean documentaries, hated onions. Asked too many questions. Called the mansion the castle where nobody laughs. Sandro had almost smiled at that one. Almost. Then Camille arrived. Camille Draven was the kind of woman men confused with destiny. Because she knew exactly how to enter a room like it had been built for her. And only her in advance. She came from an old crime family dressed in charitable foundations and European artboards. Her father, Salvatore Draven, controlled the ports up and down the eastern shore. Her uncle controlled judges. Her cousins controlled men who wore gloves, for reasons polite people didn't ask about. A marriage between Sandro Rocca and Camille Draven would join 2 families that had distrusted each other for 2 decades. It would calm a war nobody spoke of at dinner parties. It would secure the harbor routes both families needed, and neither wanted to fight over anymore. It would make every enemy in 3 states think twice before moving against either name. That was what everyone said. Sandro knew better than to believe in simple peace. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, years before in the very silence his mother now lived inside. But his empire was tired. His men were restless. And his mother had been too quiet too long in a house full of expensive solutions that couldn't fix the one thing that actually mattered. So he agreed to the engagement. He told himself it was strategy. Camille was beautiful, educated, compostal. She didn't ask him for tenderness. She seemed perfectly content with power instead. And when she kissed Adriana's cheek in front of him, called her Mama Adriana in that warm, practiced voice, Sandro allowed himself the smallest, most dangerous thing a man like him could allow. Relief. He wanted peace in his house. He wanted badly to believe one woman could sit beside his mother without becoming another threat he'd eventually have to destroy. But Adriana never touched Camille willingly. Sandro saw that too late. Nora saw it on day 1. And Camille saw seeing it. That was when the war between them started. Not with shouting. Not at first. With little cruelties. The kind polite society specializes in. Camille would move the water glass 2 inches too far from Adriana's reach. She'd ask Nora, in front of guests, whether women of your size tire more easily. She'd rest her hand on Sandro's arm every single time. Nora translated one of Adriana's refusals, as if to remind the room whose finger wore the ring. And the second Sandro left a room, Camille's smile would disappear like a mask taken off after a performance. So devoted, she told Nora once, while Adriana sat stiff and silent by the fireplace. Nora's kept folding a blanket. She deserves devotion, she said. She's cared for. There's a difference. Camille's eyes sharpened. Careful, she said. In houses like this, women who think they're morally superior usually discover they're only replaceable. Nora said nothing. She'd learned long ago that not every battle gets won by answering. Vincent had worked for the Rocca family for 11 years. And in that time he had developed exactly one hobby, which was watching people underestimate his boss. He watched Camille do it constantly. He never said anything. Vincent didn't talk much. He was built like a door. wide, solid, and mostly there to keep bad things out. But his eyes worked fine, and what they saw in those early months of Sumps worried him in a way he couldn't quite put into words yet, which is maybe why when the new guard arrived that spring, Vincent felt something loosen in his chest he hadn't expected. Renzo. Younger. Sharp, the kind of easy disarming charm that made staff relax around him within a day. Which, in Vincent's experience, was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and there was rarely an in-between. Vincent asked him the first week. Testing. Us tests? West Coast mostly. Renzo shrugged. Needed something quieter. Nothing's quiet here, Renzo laughed. Yeah, I'm starting to notice that he was good with Milo on the rare afternoons the boy visited the estate. Good with the staff. Good notably with Nora. A little too easy in her orbit for Vincent's taste, though he chalked that up to instinct rather than evidence. Because evidence so far there was none of. Still. Vincent watched. That was after all his one hobby. The black car appeared outside Stin Elementary on a Tuesday. Nora noticed it the moment she pulled up to collect Milo. Black sedan, Rhode Island plates. A man in sunglasses sitting behind the wheel, though the sky that day was the color of wet cement. He watched the school gate with the lazy patience of a man being paid specifically not to look away. Nora took Milo's hand till too tight. Ow, he said. Mom, sorry, are you mad?
No, that was the first lie.
By Thursday the car had come back twice more. By Thursday afternoon, Camille had said Milo's name for the first time out loud in front of Nora in a tone that made the temperature of the entire hallway drop 10 degrees. Such a sweet boy, Camille said, watching Nora fold linens in the hallway outside Adriana's room. Blue backpack. Very distinctive. Nora's hand stopped moving. You've seen him, Camille smiled, the kind of smile that has a knife folded up somewhere behind it. Waiting. I make it my business to know the people who work in my future home, she said. Isn't that responsible of me? Nora didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around the words before they could get out. That night, alone in her small guest cottage on this estate grounds, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone in both hands, staring at it like it might bite her. Call the police. Tell them what? That a woman said a nice thing about your son in a hallway. They'd laugh her out of the precinct. Tell Sandro. And say what? That his fiancé scares me. He'd believe his fiancé. Everyone had told her that from day. Sandro will believe his fiancé before he believes a hired woman with bills to pay. So Nora did the thing she'd done her whole life whenever the ground got unstable beneath her. She went quiet. She waited. And she was wrong to. She knew that later. But in the moment, quiet felt like the only safe thing left in the entire world. Thursday came in gray and heavy, the kind of Halstead Bay afternoon where the fog doesn't lift so much as it gives up trying. Adriana had asked for tea at 4. Nora brought it up with the writing board tucked under her arm, the way she always did. Because some days Adriana wanted to write, and some days she just wanted someone in the room who wouldn't fill the silence with noise for the sake of filling it. Today was a writing day. Nora could tell from the set of Adriana's jaw before she even sat down. Adriana tapped the board twice, then wrote, Slow, careful, Camille here downstairs, Nora said. With the caterers. The dinner's tomorrow, remember. Adriana's mouth pressed thin. She wrote one more word. Careful. Nora's stomach turned over, quiet and cold. Careful what? Adriana didn't answer. Couldn't, not fully. The board could only hold so much, and some things Nora had learned, Adriana simply refused to spell out even when she had the strength to, as if writing them down made them realer than she could stand. She set the pen down instead. Reached for Nora's hand, squeezed once. That was answer enough. At 4:10, Camille came upstairs to check on preparations, which everyone in that house understood by now meant she wanted an audience for whatever cruelty she'd rehearsed that afternoon. She found Nora adjusting Adriana's shawl. Leave us, Camille said, pleasant. Bright. The tone she used for staff, for waiters, for anyone she considered set dressing in her own life. Mrs. Rocca hasn't finished her tea, I said, leave us. Nora glanced at Adriana. Adriana's eyes held hers for a half second, a warning sharp and unmistakable. Though there was nothing on the board to spell it with, Nora stepped into the hallway, not far. Just far enough to be technically obedient. She didn't mean to listen at first. Then she heard her own name. Then she heard Milo's, and after that listening wasn't a choice anymore, it was survival. Camille's voice, low and honeyed, drifted through the half-open door. Tomorrow night, she was saying, when Sandro asks for your blessing, you're going to give it to me. Silence, the scrape of the writing board being pulled closer, Adriana's small defiant motion. No, Camille read aloud, mocking. How predictable. Nora's pulse climbed into her throat. You know, Camille went on, conversational, almost bored. I've been very patient with you. Sitting through your little taps and blinks, like you're some kind of oracle. But I think it's time we skip ahead to the part where you understand your position in this house. A sound. Fabric shifting, the just a creak of Adriana's wheelchair. Tell Sandro Adriana accepts me, Camille said. No response Nora could hear. She doesn't accept me, Camille continued. And here her voice dropped, sharpened, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to show the thing underneath it. She can't speak, but she can answer. And Nora louder now, deliberately, so the hallway would catch it too. You're her voice. So you'll make her say yes. Nora's back hit the wall before she realized she'd stepped away from the door. She should have kept walking, should have gone downstairs, found Vincent, found anyone. Instead she pushed the door open. I won't lie for you, she said. Camille turned, unhurried, like she'd been expecting exactly this. Oh good, she said. You're here, saves me finding you, I won't do ill, and that was the sentence. The hinge the whole afternoon swung on, because Camille smiled then. Really smiled. Teeth and all. The mask fully gone, and said the words that would end her, though none of them knew that yet. Unless you want your son to disappear from school tomorrow. The room tilted. Blue backpack, Camille said, savoring it. Red inhaler clipped to the side pocket. He waits near the side gate because he likes watching the neighbor's dog through the fence. Children are very easy to find. When their mothers are predictable. Nora didn't scream. She'd learned a long time ago that screaming just tells cruel people exactly where they've hurt you. But her breath broke. Audibly. A small cracked sound she hated herself for. Because it meant Camille had won something, even for a second. If you Camille went on, walking a slow circle now. I'll say you misunderstood Adriana. I'll say you planted fear in a sick old woman's head. I'll say a lonely hired woman wanted to feel important in a house she doesn't belong in. A pause. Sandro will believe his facade. Before he believes a nanny with bills to pay. You don't know him, Nora whispered. No, Camille said, you don't. Then she reached down and slid the writing board out from beneath Adriana's trembling hands. Adriana's fingers grasped at empty air. No more little messages, Camille said. And her voice had shed every last trace of sweetness now, down to the bone of it. No more warnings. Tomorrow you sit there. And you let Nora save her son by giving me exactly what I want. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of ruin. Nora didn't know in that moment that somewhere in a black SUV parked beside the harbor, a phone Camille had forgotten to hang up was carrying every single word of this straight into her fiancé's ear. She only knew she was standing in a room with a woman who had just threatened her son's life, holding onto the doorframe because her knees had stopped being reliable. Camille gasped. Then, quiet almost to herself, almost like a reflex, she whispered a name into the phone still clutched in her other hand. Sandro. The call ended. Camille stared at the blank screen for one long, uncomprehending second. Then her face did something Nora had never seen it do before. It went
What Nora said.
Very carefully was that. Camille didn't answer. She was already moving, heels clicking sharp against the hardwood, phone pressed flat to her chest like she could somehow unsend the last 4 minutes of her own voice. Adriana's hand found Nora's wrist. Gripped it. Hard. Nora looked down at her. Adriana's eyes were wide, not frightened, something closer to hope. The SUV climbed the private road to the Rock estate just as the sky finished going dark over the cliffs. Rain came sideways now, needling the windshield, and the mansion rose out of the fog like something built specifically to survive weather like this. White columns, black iron gates, lanterns glowing amber against the storm, waves breaking somewhere far below against jagged rock, the kind of house tourists photographed from boats and whispered about afterward. Sandro didn't look at it the way he usually did. Usually the house felt like an answer. Tonight it felt like a question he didn't have the stomach for yet. He came through the front doors alone. No guards. That alone would have told anyone paying attention that something had shifted. Because Sandro Rocca did not walk into his own mother's wing without at least 2 men flanking him. Not since the attack, not in 3 years. Tonight he didn't want witnesses, he wanted his mother. Upstairs Thamsthis was still kneeling beside Adriana's chair when the door opened. She startled, half rising. One hand still on Adriana's arm, Sandro stopped in the doorway. He looked for one long second, less like a man who ran an empire and more like a storm that had briefly rememberances. Black coat damp from rain, dark hair slicked flat, face calm in a way that made the whole room colder instead of warmer. Mama, he said, voice low. Rough at the edges in a way Nora had never heard from him before. I heard. Adriana closed her eyes, not in relief. In grief. Sandro crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair. The way a much smaller boy might have once, long before the empire, before the guards, before the silence that stole her voice 3 years ago and never gave it back. I heard enough, he said. Nora stood near the window, hands pressed flat against her own stomach like she could hold herself together by force if she just pressed hard enough. Sandro looked up at her. There was anger in his eyes. She braced for it instinctively the way she'd braced her whole life for anger aimed in her direction. But it wasn't aimed at her, which somehow made it worse. "Your son is safe," he said. The words hit her so hard she had to grab the windowsill to stay upright. "What? Vincent's at the school. Nobody releases him to anyone but you. Or my men." "Your men." The words came out, sharper than she meant them to, fear making her braver than good sense usually allowed. "He's a child, not a package to secure." Sandro held her gaze. Most men in his world would have punished a tone like that, coming from someone who worked for them, in a house like this. He didn't. "You're right," he said instead. The answer disarmed her more than anger ever could have. He stood slowly, and something in his posture changed. Not softer, exactly, but reoriented, like a compass needle finally swinging toward true north after years of pointing at something convenient instead. "You'll call him yourself," he said. "You'll speak to him. Then you'll tell me everything Camille has done in this house. Everything starting from the beginning." Nora's lips parted. No sound came. Sandro glanced at his mother, then back at Nora. "Not because I command it," he said, quiet now. "Because I failed to see what was happening under my own roof, and I don't intend to fail at it twice." The phone call with Milo was short. Too short. Nora would think about that later. How a conversation that mattered so much could take less than a minute to have. His voice came through small and confused, but cheerful in that resilient 9-year-old way that made her chest ache. "Mom, a scary tall man bought me a sandwich." Nora closed her eye. "Are you okay? Yeah. He said you were busy. I should stay with Sister Margaret until you call again." A pause. Then, curious rather than afraid. "Is this because of gangsing?" Nora's blood went cold. "What lady?" "The one who asked if I was your son yesterday. She smelled like flowers. But not good flowers." Nora's eyes flew open. Sandro was watching her across the room and his face didn't change, but something in the air around him did. "Milo," she said carefully. "I love you. Stay with Sister Margaret." Okay. "Love you too." The call ended. Nora's hand wouldn't stop shaking. Sandro took a half step toward her, then stopped himself like he'd caught his own hand reaching for something it hadn't been given permission to touch. "Tell me." So she did. Not cleanly, not bravely. It came out of her in broken pieces, one after another, and once she started she couldn't seem to stop. Camille moving the board. Camille whispering in Adriana's ear when no one else was in the room. Camille asking in front of 3 separate guests over 3 separate weeks whether Adriana's signs could simply be misread by someone eager for attention. The black car. The school gate. The threats. The way Adriana had tried to warn her, over and over, by touching the small silver cross at her throat while Camille smiled beside her like nothing at all was wrong. Sandros listened. He didn't interrupt. Only once did his composure crack, when Nora said quietly that Camille had called Adriana a silent burden in front of the catering staff. Sandro turned away from both of them, and pressed one hand flat against the wall, like he needed something solid to hold up the weight of what he'd just heard. For a moment he looked less like a man who ran half the ports on the eastern seaboard, and more like someone holding back something violent enough to frighten even himself. Adriana tapped twice. Sandro turned back. His mother lifted the board with visible effort. "Not Nora's fault." Sandro read it. His jaw tightened until Nora could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. "I know," he said. Nora looked down at her hands. "You should blame me a little," she said. Asked if your mother was tired. I said yes. She wasn't tired, she was terrified. "Yes," Sandro said. And the single word hurt more than shouting would have. "And Camille knew exactly where your son waited after school." Nora's eyes burned. "I thought if I just survived one more day I'd find a way out." She laughed, humorless, brittle. "Women shouldn't have to survive inside someone else's house." "No," Sandro said quietly. "They shouldn't." That sentence after that was dangerous in a different way than the one before it. Nora looked at him and realized with something close to dread that she'd said something true enough to land somewhere he hadn't expected to be hit. Wrote one more line slower this time, like the effort was costing her something real. "Tomorrow." Sandro turned to his mother. Yes," he said. "Tomorrow." Nora understood before he explained it and stepped back instinctively, like distance might undo whatever he was about to decide. "No," she said. "You want to expose Camille at the dinner. I want my mother to speak. She'll come after Milo again. She won't reach him." Sandro's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Not again. "You don't know that." He stepped closer. Nora forced herself not to retreat, though every instinct in her body told her that men like him were not safe to stand this close to, even maybe especially when they were trying to protect you. He smelled like rain, leather, and something faintly like smoke, and his presence seemed to fill the room until to even the shadows in the corners felt like they belonged to him. I know exactly what kind of woman Camille is now, he said. That makes her less dangerous. No, Nora whispered. That makes her desperate. Something shifted behind Sandro's eyes, not quite approval. Something adjacent to it. You understand danger better than most men on my payroll, he said. I understand mothers, Nora said. And I understand who smile while hiding knives. Sandro's gaze dropped briefly to her trembling hands. Then for the first time he touched her. Only 2 fingers, resting lightly beneath her wrist, steadying the pulse that had been betraying her for the last 10 minutes. Nora froze. The touch wasn't romantic. It was too controlled for that. Too careful. Too aware of every terrible thing it could have been and wasn't. But it was the first time in years that someone powerful had touched her like she wasn't something to move, use, or dismiss. Your son is under my protection, Sandro said. I didn't ask for that. No. You earned it. When you protected my mother. I protected her because she deserved it. That, Sandro said's exactly why you earned it. Nora looked away first. She hated how much in that moment she wanted to believe him. Downstairs in a swing of the house nobody thought to check that night. Renzo stood by a window with his phone pressed to his ear, voice low, clipped, careful in the particular way people are careful when they know a house has more ears in the walls than it lets on. She said, "What?" he murmured. A pause. Someone on the other end, unheard, unnamed. No, listen, if Raka knows about the call, that changes everything. That's not a delay, that's a different game entirely. Another pause. Longer. I didn't sign up to be anywhere near a child, Renzo said. Quieter now. That wasn't the deal. He said. Whatever came back made something in his jaw tighten. Fine, he said finally, fine, I'll get you what you need. But this ends soon, it has to. He hung up, stood there a moment longer staring out at the storm battering the cliffs, at the black water churning far below. Then he straightened his collar, put on the easy disarming smile that had made half the staff trust him within a week of his arrival, and walked back down the hallway like a man with absolutely nothing on his mind at all. The next morning, the mansion woke like a theater preparing for a performance nobody in the audience yet knew would end in disaster. Florists arrived at dawn, arms full of white roses and blue hydrangeas that would never make it to the vases they were meant for. Caterers carried silver trays through the service entrance in a steady, practiced rhythm. Guards checked guest lists twice, then a third time, murmuring into hidden earpieces with the tension none of them could quite name but all of them could feel. Nora hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in the small guest cottage with Milo curled against her side. Sandro had insisted he be brought home under guard the moment the school day ended, a decision she hadn't had the strength left to argue with. Listening to the rain finally taper off into a heavy waiting quiet. Milo, for his part, had taken the entire ordeal with the grave seriousness of a 9-year-old who had just discovered his life contained more excitement than he'd previously believed possible. So there's an actual mafia, he said, around a mouthful of cereal. At 6 in the morning. Like in movies. Is the scary man really a mafia boss? Eat your cereal. Does that mean I'm basically in witness protection? Nora closed her eyes and despite everything, despite the exhaustion pressing down on her chest like a stone, felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. It was the first time in 18 hours anything had. Eat your cereal, Milo. He ate his cereal. But he kept glancing toward the window every few minutes, watching the black car, a different one now, a Raka car, parked deliberately visible at the end of the drive, like he was cataloging the exact dimensions of his new strange safety. Nora watched him do it and felt something twist in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Because he shouldn't have to notice cars like that. Not at 9. Not ever if she could help it. And yet here they were. By noon, word had begun spreading through the house in the particular hushed, electric way that scandal always spreads among staff, who know more than they're supposed to and less than they'd like. Rosa, who'd worked in the kitchen for 15 years and had opinions about absolutely everything, cornered Nora near the pantry with a look that was equal parts concern and hunger for details. Is it true? Rosa whispered. About the phone call. I can't talk about it, Rosa, madre dia. Rosa crossed herself, an old habit from an old country done automatically. That woman, I told Vincent months ago there was something wrong with her smile. You ever notice? It doesn't move her eyes. Nora hadn't noticed, now she couldn't stop noticing. Is Adriana all right? And the boy, Nortra's throat tightened. He's safe. Rosa studied her for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed her arm, quick and firm, the way an aunt might. You did the right thing, she said. Standing up like that, not many would. Not in this house. I didn't feel brave. Bravery never feels like anything, Rosa said, already turning back to her ovens. It just looks like something after. Nora carried that sentence with her for the rest of the day, turning it over like a stone in her pocket. At 2 in the afternoon, Sandro found her in the east hallway, arms full of freshly pressed linens for that evening's tasteful settings, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. He looked different in daylight. Less like the storm from the night before. More like a man who hadn't slept either, though he carried it with a discipline she suspected came from decades of practice. "How's Milo?" he said. Not really a question. More a thing he needed to ask out loud to make sure the answer was still true. Confused, excited. Convinced he's in witness protection. Nora shifted the linens in her arms. "He's fine. Better than I am, honestly." Something almost like humor flickered across Sandro's face. Gone almost before it arrived. "He asked if you're a vampire," Nora added, before she could stop herself. "I told him I didn't know you well enough to confirm or deny." "A vampire, a polite one, his." Sandro's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smile. Adjacent to the idea of one, like a language he hadn't used in a long time. "Tell him I don't own the ocean," he said. "In case that comes up, I'll pass that along." The moment stretched a beat longer than it needed to. Nora felt it stretch, felt herself notice him noticing her noticing it, and looked away first, cheeks warming despite everything. Despite the danger. Despite the fact that this entire conversation was happening in a house currently preparing to detonate at dinner. "Tin tight," Sandro said, a voice dropping back into something more careful. "Whatever happens. You don't have to speak unless you choose to. Your mother needs someone to translate." "My mother," Sandro said, "will decide tonight whether she needs a translator at all." Nora frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," Sandro, already turning to walk away, "that tonight, no one speaks for her. Unless she chooses it." He left her standing in the hallway, arms full of linens, heart doing something complicated it had no business doing given everything. Camille, for her part, spent the day exactly as she spent every day before a performance, preparing. She had not fled. That surprised even some of her own family when they heard the details later. A lesser woman might have run the moment that call ended, might have packed a bag and vanished before Sandro could confront her directly. But Camille Draven did not believe in running from problems. She believed in reframing them. By the time she descended the main staircase that evening in a cream silk gown, hair pinned to perfection, expression composed into something serene and faintly wounded, the exact expression of a woman who has been terribly unfairly misunderstood, she had already rehearsed 4 separate versions of events, each calibrated to a different possible confrontation. She had not, however, rehearsed for a recording. That detail she did not yet know existed, which made everything that followed in retrospect almost inevitable. Adriana sat by her window that afternoon longer than usual, writing board resting untouched in her lap, watching the gray Atlantic churn below the cliffs. Nora found her there around 4, bringing tea neither of them would drink. "You don't have to do this tonight," Nora said quietly, kneeling beside the chair. "Whatever Sandro's planning, you could wait, let things settle." Adriana's eyes found hers. Something fierce lived behind them. Something that 3 of silence hadn't managed to dim, not even a little. She lifted a trembling hand and tapped the board once. "No." Then, slowly, painstakingly, she wrote 4 more words, each letter costing her something visible. "I have waited enough." Nora's eyes filled before she could stop them. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Adriana reached over and touched Nora's cheek, the gesture soft, maternal, entirely unlike anything Nora had experienced from her own mother in the exhausted, overworked years before Nora had grown up and started raising herself. Adriana's thumb brushed away a tear Nora hadn't realized had fallen. Then she wrote one final line, and this one, when Nora read it, made her breath catch entirely. "Good mother, afraid," both true. For days Nora had hated herself for the fear. Afraid women always look weak from the outside to people who've never had anything worth losing. But Adriana, who had survived the exact kind of violence that steals speech from a body and safety from a soul, understood fear differently than most. Fear wasn't failure. Fear was just the body trying, however clumsily, to keep the people you love alive. The storm returned by sunset, rain slamming the tall windows of the dining hall in long percussive bursts as the first guests arrived beneath black umbrellas. The Draven family came dressed in old money arrogance polished to a high shine. Salvatore Draven led them, leaning on a silver cane he did not need. The kind of prop powerful men carry to remind rooms they've earned the right to move slowly. Camille's mother wore pearls at her throat that could have paid a year of Nora's rent twice over. Her brothers smiled like wolves who'd been told, specifically, to look tame for the cameras. The raucous side of the room watched them arrive without warmth. Every alliance in that hall had a price tag somewhere on it. Every smile carried a blade folded up neatly behind the teeth. Nora entered beside Adriana's wheelchair, one hand resting on its back, the writing board across Adriana's lap where it always sat. She wore a simple dark green dress not her own. Sandro had ordered it delivered that afternoon after overhearing apparently a maid mention that Nora's usual uniform wasn't appropriate for a dinner like this. Nora had almost refused it on principle. Then she'd seen Adriana tap twice in approval, and something in her had softened enough to accept. The dress fit her in ways she wasn't used to letting clothes fit her. It didn't hide her body, it honored it. Soft fabric gathered at her waist, sleeves that framed her arms instead of apologizing for them. A neckline modest but undeniably elegant. When she'd looked in the mirror an hour earlier, she'd seen a woman who still looked tired, still looked afraid, but no longer looked invisible. Sandro noticed the moment she walked in. His gaze paused on her, not long, long enough. Nora felt it land like heat across the room, and something in her chest that tightened in response before she could stop it. Camille noticed that too. Her fingers tightened fractionally around the stem of her champagne glass, the only crack in an otherwise flawless performance. Dinner began, as these dinners always did, with polite lies dressed up as toasts. To unity, to family, to the future. To peace between two houses that had spent 20 years quietly hating each other in expensive rooms exactly like this one. Nora stood behind Adriana's chair, listening to powerful people speak warmly of loyalty, while somewhere beneath the surface of the evening, a woman's silence was about to be either exploited or exposed, depending entirely on which side of the table you were sitting. Sandro sat at the head of the table, expression unreadable, the same controlled mask he wore into every room that mattered. Camille sat at his right, radiant in ivory, a ring glittering on her finger, the Raka engagement ring, a black diamond ringed in white stones, an heirloom older than most of the grudges currently seated at this table. Every few minutes without fail, Camille's gaze slid toward Nora. "Remember your son." Nora looked at Adriana's instead each time. Adriana looked back, together they waited. Near the end of the meal, Sandro rose. The room quieted instantly, the way rooms full of powerful people always quiet when the most powerful person in it decides to stand. Rain tapped against the glass like impatient fingers demanding entry. "My family knows why we're here," Sandro said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, it carried anyway. The way stones carry weight regardless of how gently you set them down. "Before I marry, my mother gives her blessing. Without it, there's no marriage." Camille smiled, a perfect smile, the kind built for photographs, society pages, and men foolish enough to trust a face that pretty. Sandro stepped away from the head of the table and walked to Adriana's chair. Nora's hands tightened around its back. "Sandro," he said, "do you bless my marriage to Camille Draven?" The whole room seemed to stop breathing at once. Camille turned her head slightly. Her eyes found Nora across the table, and for one terrible suspended second Nora saw Milo standing outside the school gate. Blue backpack. Red inhaler. Small face scanning the crowd for hers, she saw the black car. She saw every possible way the world had, in the punished mothers for choosing truth over silence. Then she felt Adriana's hand cover hers, fragile, warm, trembling. Certain, Nora stepped forward. "Mrs. Rocca will speak for herself." A murmur moved through the room like wind through dry grass. Camille laughed light, dismissive. "She's tired," she said. "This has been an emotional week. Nora can tell us what she means, I'm sure." He looked at Nora. No command in it. No pressure. Just a quiet, steady nod. "The choice is yours." Nora placed the writing board in Adriana's lap and pressed the pen into her hand. Adriana's fingers shook violently against the wood. For one agonizing second, nothing happened at all. Camille seized the silence instantly, the way she seized everything. Before anyone else even registered there was room to move. "See," she said, softening her voice for the benefit of the watching room, "she can barely hold the pen. We shouldn't humiliate her like this." "We wait," Sandro said, 2 words final. The room fell silent again, deeper this time, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Adriana pressed the pen down. Slow. Painful, every stroke visibly costing her something. She wrote one word: no. Someone at the table gasped. Camille stood too fast, her chair scraping hard against the marble floor. "She's confused," she said, voice pitching upward, control slipping for the first time all evening. "She doesn't sense what she's..." Adriana kept writing. No blessing. The room erupted into whispers, a dozen conversations breaking out at once, the careful architecture of the evening's performance beginning, finally, to crack down the middle. Camille's face tightened into something almost unrecognizable. "Nora did this," she snapped. "She's been filling your mother's head with poison. She wants power in this house." Adriana's hand moved again, slower now, exhaustion visibly setting in. Camille hurt me. Cam's mother stood abruptly. This is absurd. Adriana wrote one more line, the last of her strength clearly going into it. Nora protected me. Nora's throat closed entirely. Camille rounded on her, tears already shining perfect, luminous, camera-ready tears. Sandro darling please, she reached for him. Your mother isn't well, Nora has manipulated her. She's lonely, she wants to feel important. You know how women like her get when they finally taste a little attention. Nora flinched despite herself, the old wound reopening on contact, the way old wounds always do. His face went colder than Nora had ever seen it. Camille stepped closer, desperate now, the mask fully gone. She hates me because I'm marrying you. Because she knows once I'm your wife, she goes back to being exactly what she is. Sandro finally looked at her directly. And what is she? Camille hesitated. Too late she realized the trap she'd just walked herself into. Sandro lifted one hand. Vincent stepped forward and set a small black recorder on the table. Camille's face lost every trace of color at once. Sandro, she whispered. He pressed play. Camille's own voice filled the dining hall, unmistakable, damning every word, landing in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Tomorrow night, when Sandro asks for his mother's blessing, you'll tell him Adriana accepts me. Nora's recorded voice answered, shaking but clear. I won't lie for you. Camille's voice returned, colder now, replayed for a room full of witnesses. Unless you want your son to disappear from school tomorrow. The room froze entirely. The recording continued, relentless. Blue backpack. Red inhaler. Side gate. Children are easy to find. A woman near the far end of the table pressed a hand over her mouth. One of Camille's brothers half rose from his seat before two Raka guards materialized by fine shadows given sudden weight and purpose. Camille stared at the recorder like it had transformed into a loaded weapon aimed directly at her chest. Then came the final line. You're a hired woman with bills to pay. I'm his fiancée and Adriana can't speak. Sandro stopped the recording. The silence that followed wasn't quiet silence. It was the kind of silence that changes ownership of a room permanently. Camille looked around the table and understood, in real time, that beauty had finally completely failed her. Still, she tried. I was angry, she said quickly. She's been against me since the very beginning. You threatened a child, Sandro said, calm, unshakable. I was emotional. You abused my mother. No. Camille shook her head, tears turning frantic. Now. No longer performance but something closer to real panic finally arriving too late to matter. No, I only wanted her to accept me. I love you, Adriana tapped once against the board. No! That single tap cut through the room harder than any amount of shouting could have. Sandro looked at his mother. Then back at Camille. My mother heard the lie in you, he said, before I did. Camille's tears stopped being beautiful. I did all of this because I was afraid of losing you, she said, voice breaking for what might have been the first genuine moment of the entire evening. Sandro stepped closer. You never had me, he said. Her face crumpled entirely. He took her hand. One wild, disorienting second where she seemed to believe, against all evidence, that he was reaching for forgiveness. Then he removed the Raka ring from her finger. Slowly. Get her out of my house, Camille screamed. Not words at first, just raw, undiluted rage. Her family surged upward, chairs scraping backward across marble, Draven men reaching inside their jackets and freezing the instant they registered. Every single Raka guard in the room already had them marked. Camille pointed a shaking finger across the table at Nora, as Vincent and another guard took hold of her arms. You ruined everything, she spat. Not. Nora's knee shook, but she didn't look away, she said as loud as she felt. You did. Camille was dragged from the hall beneath chandeliers she had once believed would shine over her wedding. Salvatore did not follow his daughter out immediately. He stood by his chair a moment longer. Silver cane gripped white at the knuckle, watching his family's entire arrangement collapse, in front of 200 witnesses he had personally invited to watch what he'd believed would be a wedding announcement instead. He said nothing, not one word. That more than anything told Sandro exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Men who shout in the moment rarely plan past it. Men who go quiet are already 3 steps ahead, rewriting the next move before the first one has finished landing. Salvatore gathered the rest of his family with 2 words and a look, and left the hall the same night, the same hour, before the guards had even finished walking Camille to the gates. There was no delay, no returning 3 nights later. Whatever came next, Salvatore Draven began building it before his car had cleared the estate's private road. When the Dravens were finally gone, the room did not settle, it fractured. Guests whispered in urgent clusters. Draven relatives argued amongst themselves, though there were considerably fewer of them left in the room to argue. Sandro's uncle demanded immediate retaliation. Someone mentioned calling the police. Someone else mentioned older, colder soons. Outside, the storm slammed rain against the windows as though the sea itself had come to witness the wreckage. Sandro ignored all of it. He knelt before his mother in the center of the hall, in front of family, rivals, servants, and guards alike, and the most feared man on that entire stretch of coastline bowed his head and took his mother's trembling hands in his. "Forgive me," he said. Adriana stared at him for a long moment. Then she lifted one shaking hand and pressed it to his cheek. Tap tap, yes. Sandro closed his eyes. Nora looked away. Some moments, she understood, were simply too intimate for a crowded room to witness. Later that night, long after the guests had been escorted out, Nora found Sandro standing alone in the corridor outside his mother's room. His tie hung loose. His jacket was gone entirely. The controlled mask he wore into every room had visible cracks running through it now. "She's asleep," Nora said. He not quite meeting her eyes. "Milo's with Rosa in the guest suite." "I know." He ate 3 pieces of cake and asked if Mafia mansions always have dessert during emergencies. For the first time all night, something close to a smile pulled at the corner of Sandro's mouth almost. Then he looked at her properly. "You were brave tonight." Nora leaned against the wall, too exhausted to be anything but honest. She said, "I was terrified." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear." "That sounds like something powerful men say," Nora said, "after women like me take the risk for them." The words left her before she could stop them. Sandro looked at her. She braced herself, half expecting the consequence that came with speaking too plainly to men who held all the power in a room. Instead, he lowered his eyes. "You're right," he said. That answer unsettled her more than anger ever could have. "What happens now?" she asked, to Camille. "To all of us." His gaze moved toward his mother's closed door. "The Dravins will deny what they can. Then they'll retaliate." Nora's stomach tightened. "So it's not over?" "No," she almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "Of course it wasn't over. In fairy tales, the villain gets dragged away and the house becomes safe by morning. In real life, cruelty has cousins, bank accounts, contracts. Men with guns and grudges that outlive the original insult by decades." Sandro looked back at her, and there was no softness in his expression now. No romantic promise. Just a dangerous man calmly making a decision the rest of the world would eventually have to respect whether it wanted to or not. "Your son remains protected," he said. "Whatever comes next, he doesn't enter my world. He stays exactly where he is, safe, ordinary, untouched by any of this. You don't have to promise me that." "I'm not promising it," Sandro said. "I'm telling you it's Afesida." Nora studied him for a long moment. There was no easy comfort in his face. No performance left in him at all, not tonight. That should have frightened her, it did. But beneath the fear, something else was moving too. Something reluctant and quiet and entirely against her better judgment. Something that felt dangerously like trust. Downstairs, in a service corridor few guests ever saw, Renzo stood with his back against a cold stone wall, phone pressed to his ear again, voice low and clipped. "It's blown up," he said. "The recorder." Raka had a recorder the whole time. "Draven's out publicly tonight." A pause. "No," Renzo said, jaw tight. "That doesn't change what you asked me for. If anything, it makes it worse. Raka's going to lock this house down like a vault by morning. Cameras. New guards. He'll vet everyone who breathes near that mansion." Another pause, longer. "Then you'd better move fast," Renzo said finally. "Because after tonight, I don't know how much longer I can get you anything at all." He ended the call and stood there a moment in the dark, listening to the storm finally beginning, faintly, to ease outside. Then he straightened his jacket and walked back toward the light. Nora didn't sleep that night either, not really. Not the deep, dreamless kind of sleep a body actually needs. She lay in the guest cottage with Milo curled against her side, listening to his steady breathing, running the entire evening back through her mind in fragments that refused to settle into order. Camille's voice on the recording. Adriana's trembling hand, right. Sandro kneeling in front of the whole room, asking his mother for forgiveness like the most powerful man on the coast was, underneath it all, still just stepson. And beneath all of that, quieter, a detail that had been nagging at her since the moment Milo first mentioned it on the phone. The woman with the shiny earrings. She smelled like flowers. But not good flowers. Camille had known about Milo's school, his inhaler. His habit of watching the neighbor's dog through the fence at exactly the same time every afternoon. Someone had told her all of it. Someone inside this house. Nora sat up slowly in the dark, careful not to wake Milo, and stared at the far wall of the cottage like the answer might be written there if she looked hard enough. Because Camille didn't do her own reconnaissance. Women like Camille didn't sit in cars outside elementary schools. They paid other people to do that. which meant somebody close enough to know Milo's schedule, close enough to know which gate he waited at, which afternoons Nora worked late, which details mattered, had handed that information over. Somebody inside the Rocca estate. Nora thought of Rosa immediately and dismissed it just as fast. 15 years of loyalty. And besides, Rosa had cried real tears tonight, the kind you can't fake. She thought of the maids, of the caterers, of Vincent, and dismissed him too because Vincent had been the one standing at Milo's school gate before Camille's men could get anywhere near it. And then unbidden, she thought of Renzo. Easy smile. Quick with a joke. A little too comfortable lately, drifting into conversations that weren't quite his to be part of. She had no proof. Nothing but a feeling, thin and uncertain, the kind of thing you couldn't say out loud without sounding paranoid after the worst night of your life. But it sat there in her chest anyway, cold and immovable. Someone in this house had sold Milo's safety to the enemy. And whoever it was still inside these walls, still watching, still waiting for whatever came next. Outside, the storm finally broke apart into a thin, exhausted drizzle, and somewhere beyond the cliffs, the black water kept moving, patient and indifferent, the way it always had, the way it always would. Completely unconcerned with which of the people sleeping above it would still be standing by morning. The morning after was the kind of morning that doesn't forgive anyone. Gray light came up flat and cold over Halstead Bay, no sunrise to speak of, just night giving way to day the way a fist unclenches, reluctant and not all the way. Rain had stopped sometime near dawn. The estate sat soaked and silent under it, gravel drive dark with water, hedges dripping, the whole property looking like it had been crying all night and hadn't quite finished. Sandro hadn't slept. He stood at the window of his study with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching two black cars roll slowly up the private road. New men he'd called himself, at 3 a.m, voice flat, giving instructions nobody argued with, because after last night, trust wasn't a policy anymore, it was a liability, and Sandro Rocca did not keep liabilities lying around his own house. Vincent knocked once and let himself in without waiting for an answer, which told Sandro everything about how the night had gone, even before Vincent opened his mouth. Cameras are up in the East Wing, Vincent said. West Wing by noon. I want new locks on Mrs. Rocca's floor by tonight. Do it, and the staff. Sandro turn revet, Vincent said. Everyone, background, financials, families. Starting today. Sandro didn't answer right away. He looked instead like a man doing math in his head that he didn't like the answer to. You think it's someone inside, he said. Not a question. A confirmation he already didn't want. I think, Vincent said carefully, that Camille Draven didn't sit in a car outside a grade school herself. Women like her don't do their own surveillance. Somebody handed her Milo's schedule, somebody who already had it. Sandro set the coffee down, slow, deliberate. The kind of slow that meant something underneath it was moving fast. Then find them, he said. That's what I intend to do, Vincent. Vincent paused at the door. Quietly, Sandro said. Whoever it is, I don't want them running before we know who they're running to. Vincent nodded once and left. Sandro stood there a moment longer, alone, staring at the closed door like it might still have something to tell him. Because here was the thing that kept turning over in his chest since 4:17 the previous afternoon. Refusing to still. It wasn't only that Camille had threatened a child. Men and women both had threatened worse in this business, over smaller stakes. What kept him up all night wasn't the cruelty. It was the precision. Camille hadn't guessed at Milo's schedule. Down to the backpack, down to the inhaler. Down to the specific afternoon habit of a 9-year-old boy watching a neighbor's dog through a fence. That wasn't a threat built on rumor. That was a threat built on a source, and sources in Sandro's experience were rarely as far away as you hoped. Nora woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of Milo negotiating with Rosa about whether 9-year-olds were legally required to eat vegetables at breakfast in a house this large. It's a mansion rule, Milo was saying, with the total conviction of a boy who had clearly rehearsed this argument in the shower. Bigger house, less broccoli. That's just math. That is nonsense. Wearing a tie. I don't even own a tie. Exactly my point. Nora came into the kitchen still half asleep, hair pulled back in a knot that had given up sometime around 3 a.m, and found her son perched on a stool at the enormous marble island, feet swinging, completely unbothered by the fact that his entire world had nearly ended less than 18 hours earlier. Children were resilient like that. It should have comforted her. Mostly it terrified her. Because she knew the hard way, years ago in a bathroom with Milo asleep in a laundry basket, that resilience in children wasn't the same thing as safety. Resilience was just what you called The thing that let them survive what you couldn't stop from happening to them in the first place is. Morning, Rosa said, sliding a plate toward her without asking. Eat. You look like you fought a war last night. Feels like it. You won though. Nora sat, picked up a fork, didn't eat. Did I? Rosa's face softened in a way that undid something in Nora's chest. Sweetheart, that woman is gone. Adriana said no in front of everyone. That's not nothing, it's not everything either. Rosa didn't argue with that. She just refilled Nora's coffee, the way people do when they've run out of comfort but still want to offer something. Milo, oblivious to the weight sitting on the two women across from him, pointed his fork at Nora. Mom, is Sandro really going to marry someone else now? Because he seems kind of sad about it, and I don't think he should be sad about a lady who threatened to kidnap me. Nora nearly choked on her coffee. Milo. What? It's a valid point. Eat your bacon. That's not even a vegetable, that's a win-win. Milo. He ate his bacon. But he kept glancing toward the doorway, the way he'd been doing since yesterday, cataloging exits and adults and the general shape of danger the way children do when they've been handed too much information too fast and are trying quietly to build their own map of it. Nora watched him do it and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with Camille at all. Because her son shouldn't know what an exit looked like. Not at 9, and yet here they were. Renzo found Nora in the linen room around 10 that morning, folding towels with the mechanical focus of a woman trying not to think about anything at all, which of course made her think about everything. Rough night, he said, leaning in the doorway with that easy smile that had made half the household comfortable around him within a week of his arrival. You could say that. Heard it was quite a show. Nora glanced up. Something in his tone, casual, almost too casual, snagged against her attention like a nail on fabric. You weren't there. Wasn't on the guest list. Renzo shrugged. Security detail. We watched the doors, not the dinner theater, right? He picked up a towel, folded it badly, set it back down. Milo doing okay after everything? He's fine. Good. Good. A pause. Must have been terrifying knowing someone had eyes on him like that. Knowing exactly where he waited every day, which gate, what time. Nora's hands stilled on the towel in her lap. She hadn't said any of that. Not to Renzo. Not out loud, not to anyone else that room last night except Sandro and Adriana.
And the recording itself,
which had played to a closed dining hall behind locked doors. How did you know it was the side gate? She said. Carefully. Too carefully. Renzo, some smile. Not fast. Something behind it recalibrated fast, the way a poker player's face does when the card they didn't want just landed face up on the table. Vincent mentioned it, he said. This morning. Security briefing. Vincent wasn't in the briefing until after I left the kitchen. Must have been somebody else then. Renzo pushed off the doorframe. Easy, unhurried. Anyway, glad the kid's safe. That's the important thing. He left before she could say anything else. Nora sat very still in the linen room for a long moment afterward, towel forgotten in her lap, heart going harder than the moment probably called for. Because maybe it was nothing. Maybe security briefings really did get passed around loose and informal in a house this size, gossip traveling faster than official channels the way it always does in places where people work too close together for too many hours. Or maybe. Except she didn't finish the thought, she didn't have proof of anything. Just a feeling thin as a wire humming somewhere under her ribs. But it stayed there all day humming. Sandro spent the afternoon in a room he rarely used, a converted study on the ground floor that had once belonged to his father. All dark wood and old maps of the harbor pinned under glass, kept exactly as it had been left because some rooms you don't redecorate, you just inherit. His attorney sat across the desk from him. A careful man named Whitfield, gray at the temples, the kind of lawyer who billed by the hour and had never once in 15 years made Sandro regret the rate. Walk me through it again, Sandro said. Whitfield adjusted his glasses. The Harbor Authority Board. 7 seats. Rocca and Draven interests currently split 4-3 our favor, has been for a decade, and the marriage, Whitfield said, would have shifted 2 independent seats, both currently held by families with long-standing ties to the Draven side, both of whom have quietly indicated they'd support consolidation once the 2 houses were formally united. He paused. 3-7 becomes some Once that happens, the Harbor Authority isn't split anymore. It's Draven-controlled in practice, regardless of who technically sits where. Sandro sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, gray water moved against gray rock, endless, indifferent. They didn't want a wedding, he said finally. No. They wanted a vote. Choosing his words the way careful men always do, when they're about to say something that will land badly. That Camille Draven was never marrying you for love, Sandro. I don't say that to wound you. I say it because the paperwork agrees with me. Sandro almost laughed. It came out closer to something else, because here was the thing that had never once occurred to him, not really, not until this exact moment sitting in his father's old chair under his father's old maps. He'd told himself the engagement was strategy. He'd told himself he was the one playing the long game, securing peace on his own terms, protecting his mother and his men and his name with a calculated bloodless move that cost him nothing but a ring and a few quiet dinners. It had never crossed his mind that he wasn't the one holding the cards, that he'd been the asset all along, not the player. "Show me the seats," he said, "the two independent ones." Names. Whitfield slid a folder across the desk. Sandra opened it. Read. Read again. Then he sat back and something settled in his chest that was colder and steadier than the rage from the night before. Rage burns fast and hot, and eventually it burns out. This was something else. This was the particular patient stillness of a man who has just realized exactly how large the board actually is and has decided quietly to redraw it. "Get me everything on Salvatore Draven," Sandro said. "Everything. 10 years back. Every deal, every shell company, every port contract with his name within 3 signatures of it. That's a significant undertaking, then start today." Whitfield closed his own folder, stood paused at the door, the way careful men do when they have one more thing to say for sure they should. "Sandro." "Yes. If this goes where I think it's going to go," Whitfield said, "it isn't going to end with a broken engagement." Camille was the soft version of this plan. "Whatever her father does next won't be soft, I know. Do you?" Sandro looked up at him. Something in his face had already gone somewhere. Whitfield didn't recognize. Somewhere older. Somewhere that had nothing to do with contracts or seats or harbor authority votes. "He came for a 9-year-old boy," Sandro said quietly. "Through his own daughter's mouth. That tells me exactly what kind of man I'm dealing with. I don't need the paperwork to know that." "Then why do you want it?" "Because the paperwork," Sandro said, "is how I bury him without ever having to touch him." Whitfield left without another word. Sandro sat alone in his father's study a long time after that, the gray light shifting slowly across the old maps, the harbor outside the window, churning the same way it had churned for 100 years before either family had a name that mattered to it. He thought about his mother, silent, 3 years now, in a chair by a window, forced to watch a woman try to steal her son's blessing with a threat against a child who wasn't even hers. He thought about Nora standing in that same room, refusing to lie even with everything she loved on the line. And he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was done being careful in the way he had been careful his entire adult life. Careful had gotten his mother attacked. Careful had gotten Camille Draven within arm's reach of his family for 8 months, before anyone noticed what she actually was. Careful was Vincent's investigation moved the way these things always moved when done properly. Slow, quiet, unglamorous, mostly boring right up until the exact moment it wasn't. He started with financials. Every staff member on the estate payroll, cross-referenced against bank records. Whitfield's office pulled with the kind of legal flexibility that only exists when you're the one funding both sides of the transaction. Most came back clean. A gardener with credit card debt that predated his employment by a decade. A maid sending money home to a sister in another state, nothing hidden about it. Us records were, in Vincent's private opinion, virtuous. 15 years of steady deposits and modest savings. A woman who had clearly never once in her life considered selling anyone out for anything. Renzo's records took longer, not because they were complicated. Because they were too clean. That was the thing that snagged Vincent's attention first, not a red flag exactly. More an absence of the ordinary joys most people's financial lives generate. No debt, no overdrafts, no irregular deposits, no irregular withdrawals. A man who had apparently never made a single interesting financial decision in his life. Which, in Vincent's 11 years of experience, was itself the most interesting thing he'd found all week. He didn't say anything yet. He just watched. That was still his one hobby. 3 days after the dinner, Sandro found Milo in the East Garden, crouched by the koi pond, with the fierce concentration of a boy conducting extremely important scientific research. "What's the verdict?" Sandro said, coming to stand beside him. Milo didn't look up. "Orange one's definitely the leader, the others follow him around. He's basically the mafia boss of the pond." "Is that so?" "Yeah, you'd probably respect him." Milo finally glanced up, squinting against the gray afternoon light. "Do you have fish? Like actual fish?" "Regular fish. Do mafia bosses have hobbies?" "I have a boat." "A boat's not a hobby, that's just a vehicle. It has a fishing rod on it." "Okay, marginal improvement." Milo turned back to the pond. Then, without any warning at all, the way children do, dropping the heaviest thing in the conversation into the lightest possible, he said, "Is the scary lady really not coming back?" Sandro was quiet a moment. "No," he said, "she's not." "Good." Milo said it simply, without drama, the way a kid states a fact about weather. She smelled bad. Like flowers, but the fake kind. Mom's flowers smell better and she doesn't even buy real ones, she just uses that candle. Something moved in Sandro's chest, unfamiliar and a little unwelcome, the way things are unwelcome right up until you realize you've missed them. Your mother works very hard, he said. I know, Milo said it matter-of-factly, then added, quieter, in the particular flat voice children use when they're saying something true that causes something. To say she doesn't sleep a lot. I hear her, sometimes. At night. She thinks I don't. Sandro looked down at the boy. Small, dark-haired, entirely too observant for 9 years old, and entirely too used to worrying about an adult who was supposed to be worrying about him instead. She won't have to work that hard forever, Sandro said. You don't know that. No, Sandro admitted. But I intend to make it true anyway. Milo considered this with the grave seriousness of a much older negotiator. Okay, he said finally, but if you're lying I'm telling the koi. And he'll tell everyone, understood. They stood there a while longer, side by side, watching orange fish move in slow, indifferent circles under gray water. And neither of them said anything else, because sometimes the important things get said better in the quiet after them than in the moment itself. Nora found the two of them there 20 minutes later, and stopped in the garden path, unseen, just to watch for a moment before either of them noticed her. Sandro Rocca, a man whose name alone made grown adults reconsider their life choices, crouched by a koi pond in an expensive coat, actually listening to a 9-year-old explain fish politics with total sincerity. Something in her chest did something complicated and unhelpful. Because this was the problem, wasn't it? This was exactly the problem she'd been trying not to look at directly since the night of the dinner. Since the 2 fingers against her, since he'd said you're right instead of arguing back. Men like Sandro weren't safe. She knew that. She'd known it the day she walked through the servant's gate with her second-hand purse and her careful resume. Danger lived in a house like this the way damp lives in old walls. You couldn't always see it, but it was structural, and pretending otherwise got people hurt. And yet, here he was, crouched in the dirt in a coat that probably cost more than her car, letting a 9-year-old lecture him about koi fish hierarchy like it was the most important briefing of his week. Milo spotted her first. Mom. Sandro has a boat, but it's not a hobby, it's a vehicle. We're still arguing about it. That's a very important distinction, Nora said, coming closer. Sandro straightened and something crossed his face when he saw her, brief, unguarded, gone almost as fast as it arrived, but she caught it anyway. He's very thorough, Sandro said. Your son. He's already identified 3 flight risks among my staff based on eye contact. It's a useful skill. It's terrifying at Thanksgiving. The corner of Sandro's mouth moved. Not quite a smile adjacent to one. They stood there a moment, the 3 of them, in a garden that belonged to a family Nora had no business feeling this comfortable in, and for one dangerous, unguarded second, it felt almost like something ordinary. Like a Tuesday afternoon that didn't have any threats or recordings or dead sisters or missing fathers folded into it. Then Vincent appeared at the garden gate, face set in a particular way Nora had already learned to read as trouble, and the ordinary Tuesday evaporated instantly. Sandro said, a word. Sandro glanced at Milo, then at Nora, something apologetic flickering across his features that looked almost foreign on a face built for command. Duty calls, he said. Boring. Milo announced to the pond, which seemed to be his general verdict on adult obligations. Sandro walked toward Vincent, and Nora watched him go, watched the way his posture changed the moment he crossed from the garden into whatever waited for him at the gate. Shoulders squaring, jaw setting, the softness from a moment ago folding itself away like something too dangerous to be seen carrying. She understood, watching it happen, that this was the actual shape of his life. Softness allowed for exactly as long as no one important was watching. And then gone the instant duty called, the instant the world outside the garden gate remembered he existed. She wondered uneasily what it would cost a person to live like that. She wondered more uneasily still why she cared. Talk to me, Sandro said the moment they were out of earshot. Renzo's financials came back to clean, Vincent said. No debt, no irregular spending, which by itself means nothing. Except. I pulled his employment history again. West Coast private security, like he said. Except the company he listed folded 18 months ago. And the man who supposedly signed off on his reference letter, Vincent paused, died 2 years before that letter was written. Sandro went very still. So the reference is fake. The reference is fake. Which means the whole resume is fake. Which means, Vincent said, somebody built him a clean identity good enough to survive a normal background check. That's not cheap. That's not something a guy does on his own dime for a security job that pays what we pay. Sandro's jaw tightened. Somebody financed it. They stood in silence a moment, rain starting again somewhere behind the clouds. That particular Halstead Bay gray never quite committed to a storm or a clear sky, just hung there, undecided. Threatening. Don't move on him yet, Sandro said finally. Vincent, I want to know who's paying him. Not just that someone is. Sandro's voice had gone quiet, the way it always did right before it went dangerous. If we pull him now, whoever's behind this just finds a new door into my house. I want the hand, not the glove. That's a risk. He's already had access to Milo's schedule once. I know exactly what he's had access to, Sandro's. Switch. Starting tonight he doesn't get near either of them again. Reassign him, perimeter only. Tell him it's a rotation. And if he figures out we're onto him. Sandro looked back toward the garden, where Nora had crouched down beside Milo at the pond's edge, both of them laughing at something the koi had apparently done to earn their disapproval. Then we'll know exactly how deep this goes, he said, by how fast he runs. That night Adriana sat by her window long after the house had gone quiet, writing board in her lap untouched. Nora found her there around 11, doing her last check of the evening, and something in the older woman's posture made her stop in the doorway instead of continuing past it. You're not sleeping, Nora said. Adriana didn't look away from the window. Outside the harbor lights blinked faint and steady through the fog, small orange stars scattered along a dark coastline. She lifted a trembling hand at the board. Once no. Nora came and knelt beside the chair, the way she always did, far enough to give room. Something's bothering you, she said. More than usual, I mean. Adriana's eyes shifted to her, held there a long moment. Something old moved behind them, old and tired and carrying weight Nora had never quite been able to see the bottom of. Not in 6 months of learning this woman's language, one tap and one blink at a time. Slowly Adriana lifted the pen, wrote one word. Salvatore. Father, she said carefully. 2 taps. Yes, what about him? Adriana's hand hovered over the board a long moment like she was deciding something, weighing some old cost against some newer, more urgent one. Then she wrote 3 more words, slow, deliberate, each letter costing her visibly more than the last. Not the first time. Not the first time, she repeated. What do you mean, not the first? But Adriana set the pen down, closed her eyes, turned her face back toward the window, and the set of her jaw told Nora, without any words at all, that whatever this was, it wasn't finished tonight. It wasn't a door she was ready to open yet, not even this small a crack. Nora sat with her a while longer anyway, not asking, not pushing. Just some senses she'd learned in this house weren't refusals. They were just doors waiting for the right key. Sandro found her outside Adriana's room an hour later, sitting on the hallway bench with her knees pulled up, the way exhausted people sit when they've stopped pretending to have good posture. She's asleep, Nora said, before he could ask. He sat down beside her. Not too close. Close enough. She wrote something tonight, Nora said. About Salvatore. Sandro's whole posture changed. What did she say? Not the first time. Nora looked at him. That's it. That's all she gave me. Then she shut down. Sandro was quiet a long moment, staring at the closed door like it might tell him something his mother hadn't. The attack, he said finally, voice low. 3 years ago, the one that took her voice. He paused like the next part cost him something to say out loud. We never found who did it. Nora felt something cold move through her. You think it was Salvatore? I don't know what I think. Sandro rubbed a hand over his face, and for the first time since Nora had known him, he looked simply, plainly tired. Not controlled, not calculated, just tired the way any man looks at the end of a week that's asked too much of him. I've spent 3 years assuming it was random. A robbery gone wrong, bad luck in a bad neighborhood on a night she shouldn't have been out alone, and now I'm wondering if I built my entire understanding of my mother's life on a lie I never bothered to question. Nora didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one to give. So she did the only thing that felt true in the moment. She reached over and put her hand over his, resting on the bench between them. He looked down at it. Didn't pull away. You don't have to solve all of this tonight, she said quietly. I know, but you're going to try anyway. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. You've known me 2 weeks and you already know that about me. I've known you 6 months, Nora said. I've just been paying attention the whole time. Sandro looked at her, and for one long unguarded moment, the entire weight of the last 3 days, Camille, the recording, the board seats, the mole somewhere inside his own walls, his mother's silent secrets even he'd never suspected, seemed to lift just slightly off his shoulders. Not gone, just lighter for a second, because someone else was standing close enough to help carry it. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment ended the way moments like that always end in houses like this one. He looked at the screen. His face changed. "What is it?" Nora asked. "Whitfield," he said, standing. He found something. The something turned out to be a name. Sandro sat across from Whitfield in the study an hour later, the old maps behind glass throwing faint reflections across the desk between them, and stared at a single page like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he looked at it long enough. "Say it again," he said. "The independent seat," Whitfield said. "The one held by the Halloran family. Generations on the harbor board. Always neutral, never aligned with either house." He tapped the page. "Turns out neutral is a matter of definition. Salvatore Draven has been quietly financing the Halloran shipping business for 6 years. Loans, restructured debt. The kind of arrangement that doesn't show up unless you know exactly which shell company to trace it through. So the Halloran's vote was never independent. It hasn't been independent since before you were engaged to his daughter." Sandro sat back. Something cold settled into his chest, replacing the earlier heat entirely, the particular focused cold of a man realizing the game had started long before he'd ever agreed to play it. "How long has this been in motion?" he said. Whitfield hesitated. "Sandro, how long?" "Based on the paper trail," Whitfield said carefully, "I'd estimate the earliest moves predate your engagement by at least 3 years. Sandro's hand went very still on the desk. 3 years. 3 years ago someone had attacked his mother in a random robbery that was never quite explained to anyone's satisfaction, and taken her voice along with whatever she'd been carrying that night. 3 years ago Salvatore Draven had begun quietly buying his way into a harbor authority board seat. That would only ever matter if the Rocca family's grip on it weakened. Coincidence built entire fortunes in this business. Sandro had believed in coincidence and bad luck and bad timing for 3 long years. He didn't believe in it anymore. Sandro said. "Whoever attacked my mother that night, I don't care what it costs, I don't care how deep you have to dig. I want a name before the month is out." Whitfield nodded slowly, gathering his files. At the door he paused. "Sandro, if this is what it looks like, if Draven's been circling this family for 3 years, building toward exactly this moment, then he's been very patient," Sandro said, "and I intend to be more patient than he is." Renzo noticed the reassignment the next morning. Perimeter duty. No more proximity to the main house, no more casual conversations in linen closets, no more easy access to the family's daily rhythms. He didn't say anything to anyone about it. He simply clocked the change, the way a professional clocks any shift in the terrain, and understood with the particular clarity of a man who has done this kind of work before exactly what it meant. They knew, or they suspected. Either way, the ground under him had just gotten considerably less stable. He waited until his shift ended, walked to the far edge of the property where the cell signal was weakest and the cameras, the old cameras at least, the ones from before this week's overhaul, had never quite reached, and made a call he'd been dreading making for 3 days. It rang twice before it picked up. "They're on to me," Renzo said without preamble. A pause on the other end. Then a voice cool and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life been rushed by anything. "Are they reassigned me perimeter only? That's not a rotation. That's a leash." "Then perhaps," the voice said, "it's time you reminded them why you were placed there in the first place." Renzo's jaw tightened. "I told you. After the dinner this changes everything. Rocca's not careless anymore. He's not going to leave another opening. Everyone leaves an opening," the voice said. "You simply haven't found it yet, and you will keep looking. Because I imagine your sister would very much like to keep her restaurant. Wouldn't she?" Renzo closed his eyes. "Wouldn't she?" The voice repeated, patient. Terrible in its patience. "Yes," Renzo said quietly. "Then find me the opening." The call ended. Renzo stood there a long moment at the edge of the property, staring out at the gray water beyond the fence line, feeling the particular specific kind of trapped that doesn't come from walls or locks but from someone you love being held, invisibly, at a distance, by a man who has never once had to raise his voice to make his threats land. He thought about the little boy at the koi pond. About the way the kid had looked up at Sandro Rocca with total trust, like the world's most dangerous Anne was simply obviously safe. He thought about his sister's restaurant. Small place. 2 towns over. Her whole life folded into it. Every plate and every dollar and every early morning for the last 6 years. He thought and hated himself for thinking it, about how much easier this would be if he simply didn't care about either of them. But he did. That was the whole problem he always had. 2 days later, Nora nearly walked into the answer without meaning to. It happened in the estate's small business office, a room she rarely had reason to enter, tucked off the main hallway near Sandro's study, mostly used by the household accountant for payroll and supply orders. She'd gone in to drop off a signed timesheet, expecting the room empty. It wasn't. Renzo stood at the far filing cabinet, a drawer half open, a single folder in his hand. And the look on his face when he turned and saw her in the doorway told her everything before either of them said a single word. Guilt. Then gone, replaced almost instantly by that easy, disarming smile.
Expect anyone in here?
He said, grabbing an old form permitter paperwork. That's the payroll cabinet, is it? He glanced down at the folder like he was noticing it. For the first. Wrong drawer, my mistake. He slid it back in, closed the cabinet and walked past her toward the door, close enough that she caught for just a second the faint tension running through his shoulders, the specific tightness of a man working very hard to look relaxed. Renzo, Nora said. He stopped. That folder, she said carefully. What was in it? He turned back, and for just a moment, one unguarded flicker, gone almost before she registered it. Something like exhaustion crossed his face. Not the exhaustion of a man caught lying, something heavier. Something closer to a man who had been carrying a weight so long, he'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Nothing that concerns you, he said, quiet, almost gentle. And then, before she could press further, he added something that stopped her cold. You should watch Milo's schedule for the next few days, he said. Change his routine. Different route to school, different pickup time. Nora's blood went to ice. What do you know? Renzo said. That I've made mistakes in this house I can't undo. I'm trying to make sure I don't make a worse one. He held her gaze a beat longer, something raw underneath the words. That's all I can tell you right now. He left before she could ask anything else. Footsteps quick down the hallway, and Nora stood alone in the small office with her heart hammering, staring at a filing cabinet that had just told her without a single confirmed fact, exactly who she'd been sensing in the shadows since that first hallway conversation days ago. She went straight to Vincent. Vincent listened to the whole account without interrupting, standing very still in the corridor outside the security office, arms crossed, jaw tight. He warned you, Vincent said when she'd finished.
About Milo's schedule.
That's not something a man does if he's fully in this willingly. No, Nora agreed. It isn't. Vincent was quiet a moment, turning something over. Sandro wanted to wait. Watch who Renzo led us to before we moved, and if waiting gets my son hurt. It won't, Vincent said. And something in his voice, flat absolute. The voice of a man who had made this exact sum to himself the night of the phone call, and had no intention of breaking it, made Nora believe him despite everything. Talk to Sandro, please. Whatever plan he's running, Renzo just told me, straight to my face, that he's scared for Milo. That's not a man playing both sides comfortably. That's a man drowning. Vincent's expression shifted, something calculating replacing the flatness. Drowning men, he said slowly, sometimes grab the nearest hand instead of the one that's actually trying to save them. Meaning what? Meaning, Vincent said. Already moving. Already reaching for his phone. It might be time to offer him one. They found Renzo an hour later, alone in the small equipment room off the perimeter station, sitting on an overturned crate with his head in his hands, in a way that told Vincent, before a single word was exchanged, that whatever fight had been left in the man had mostly burned out already. Sandro entered first. Vincent stayed at the door. Renzo looked up, didn't run, didn't reach for anything, just looked for a long moment, like a man who had been waiting for this exact conversation for longer than anyone in that room realized. You knew, Sandro said, quiet, not a question. I suspected you'd figure it out eventually, Renzo said. You're smarter than Camille gave you credit for. Who's paying you? Renzo was quiet a long moment. His hands, Sandro noticed, were shaking slightly, and not from fear of him, from something closer to relief, the particular trembling of a man finally allowed to stop pretending. It's not about money, Renzo said finally. Then what? My sister, Renzo said, voice cracking slightly around the word. She has a restaurant, small place 2 towns over. 6 years of her life in that building. He looked up hard now, desperate. Salvatore Draven bought her lease 18 months ago. Through a shell company she never traced, never even knew to look for. He didn't tell me until I was already working here, already trusted, already useful. Sandro's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. And then, Renzo continued, he told me exactly what would happen to her if I didn't cooperate. Not threats with words. Threats with paperwork. Eviction notices that appeared and disappeared depending on how well I performed. Health inspections that showed up the week I hesitated. His voice dropped. He never once raised his voice at me. That's the part that still gets me. He didn't have to. You gave him Milo's schedule, Sandro said. Renzo flinched like he'd been struck. Yes. You know what he did with it, I know. Renzo's voice broke fully now, something in him finally collapsing under the weight it had been carrying alone. I've known since that night. I've barely slept since that night, I warned Nora. Today, I know it's not enough. I know it doesn't undo. No, silence, Rose said. It doesn't. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved. But it's something, Sandro said finally. Renzo looked up, something fragile and hopeful flickering across his face, the look of a drowning man who has, against all expectation, just felt something solid beneath his feet. I'm not forgiving you. Sandro's voice hard again, controlled again, the softness gone as fast as it had appeared. Understand that clearly. What you did to a child in danger. And there is no version of your reasons that changes what could have happened. I understand, but I've built an empire on understanding exactly one thing better than most men in my line of work, Sandro said. The difference between an enemy and a man an enemy is using. You are the second thing. Which means you're more useful to me alive, cooperative, and terrified of me specifically, than you are dead or in a cell somewhere. Draven can't reach you to shut you up. Renzo stared at him. You're not going to kill me. I'm going to use you, Sandro said, the way he did. Except you're going to feed him exactly what I decide he sees. And in exchange, your sister's restaurant becomes my problem instead of his tonight. Renzo's face crumpled, relief and shame arriving together, tangled, impossible to separate. Why? He said, voice barely above a whisper. Sandro's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the door, toward the direction of the east garden, the koi pond, the small boy who'd spent an entire afternoon lecturing him about fish politics with total unguarded trust. Because somebody in this house learned recently, he said, that protecting a child isn't optional. Not even when it's inconvenient. Not even when it's not technically your job. He turned back to Renzo, something final in his voice. You're going to help me protect two people who never should have been in danger in the first place. That's the only forgiveness you're getting from me. Take it or don't. Renzo took it. Of course he took it. 2 nights later, Adriana was ready to talk. Nora didn't push her toward it. She simply came in for the last check of the evening, the way she always did, and found Adriana already sitting up, writing board waiting in her lap, eyes fixed on the door like she'd been rehearsing something for hours and needed to say it before her own nerve gave out. You want to tell me about Salvatore, Nora said, sitting down beside her. 2 taps. Yes. At first, hesitant, and then, faster, like a dam that had been holding back 3 years of pressure and had finally quietly decided it was tired of holding. Sandro's father, business partner, long ago. Nora waited. He asked David, Sandro's father, to launder Draven money through the Harbor Authority. Years before the attack, and your husband refused, Nora said. 1 tap. No, Nora's stomach dropped, he agreed. 2 taps, yes. Then Adriana kept writing, handshaking harder now with the effort of it. I found out, confronted David, he ended it. Told Salvatore no, that's when it happened, Nora said quietly. The attack. Adriana's eyes filled, and for a long moment she didn't write anything at all, just sat there with the pen trembling in her hand, 3 years of silence finally cracking open all at once. Then she wrote the last line, the one that had clearly been the hardest to get to, not opt the deal completely, or lose more than money. Nora felt the floor of the entire story shift beneath her. He knew, she said. David knew who did this to you, and he never. Adriana tapped once. Hard no. Then wrote, fast. He suspected. Never proof. Died before he could get it. Nora sat back, the whole shape of it finally settling into place. Santrofas hadn't just walked away from a bad deal. He'd walked away from a bad deal after his own wife had been attacked as a warning, had spent whatever years he had left after that trying, quietly without proof, to find the man responsible, and had died before he ever got the chance. And Sandro had spent 3 years believing it was random. 3 years standing in rooms with Camille Draven, agreeing to marry into the very family that had, in all likelihood, silenced his mother permanently as a message to his father. Does Sandro know any of this? Nora asked, though she already suspected the answer. Adriana's hand hovered over the board a long moment. Then slowly she shook her head. Not yet. You have to tell him, Nora said. Adriana, he needs to know. Everything that's happening right now. The takeover, all of it. It's connected to this. He's fighting half a war blind. Adriana looked at her for a long time, something fierce and frightened both moving behind her eyes. Then she wrote one final line, and this one, more than any of the others, made Nora's chest ache, with something too large to name clean. Afraid he'll do something he can, and he is his father's son. But angrier. Nora reached out and took the older woman's trembling hand in both of hers. He's also, she said quietly, his mother's son. And you survived 3 years of silence without letting it turn you into something ugly. That has to count for something. That has to be in him too. Adriana's eyes filled again, and this time she let the tears fall, not bothering to hide them, The way you don't bother hiding anything anymore in front of someone who has already seen you at your most defenseless. She squeezed Nora's hand. Tapped twice, yes. Sandro came to see his mother the next morning, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet routine. Tea, the board, 30 minutes of careful patient conversation before the day's business swallowed him whole again. He did not expect to find Nora already there, standing near the window. Expression tight dropped before either of them said a single word. What's happened, he said. Sit down, Nora said. Gentle. Firm. The tone of someone bracing you for a fall they can't prevent, only soften. He sat. Adriana lifted the board, hands trembling worse than usual, and began, letter by careful letter, to give her son the story she had carried silently for 3 long years. Sandro read each line as it came. His face, over the course of it, went through several things in sequence: confusion, then disbelief, then something that almost like physical pain, and finally, by the end, a stillness that Nora recognized immediately because she'd seen it once before. The night of the phone call. The exact same stillness. The kind impulse than rage ever could. My father knew, he said finally, voice flat. Adriana tapped once. Then wrote suspected, not knew. Big difference. He was protecting you, me, and the business, all at once. Too much for one man. He let me build a future with that family, Sandro said. And his voice cracked slightly on the word future, the first crack Nora had ever heard in it. He let me put a ring on that woman's finger. Bring her into this house near you. He didn't know she'd use her own daughter. He only feared Salvatore. Not the daughter. Sandro stood abruptly, paced to the window, stood there with his back to both of them, shoulders rigid, breathing controlled in a way that told Nora exactly how much effort the control was currently costing him. 3 years, he said, mostly to the glass. 3 years I thought it was bad luck. A robbery, wrong place, wrong time. He turned back and his eyes had gone dark in a way she hadn't seen before, something ancient and terrible surfacing behind the usual composure. It wasn't bad luck. It was a message sent to my father through my mother's throat, and I have spent 3 years being polite to the man's daughter at family dinners. Sandro? Nora said quietly. He looked at her. Whatever you're about to decide to do, she said, do it because it's right. Not because it's fast. Your mother survived this by being patient. That's not weakness, that's how she's still here to tell you about it at all. Something in his expression cracked further, softened at the edges, the rage folding into something closer to grief. I don't know how to be patient with this, he admitted, quiet, almost ashamed of the admission. Then learn, Nora said. Because the version of you that acts on this out of pure fury is exactly what Salvatore Draven has been waiting 3 years for. Don't give him that. Give him something he doesn't see coming instead. Sandro looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, not calm, exactly, but the beginning of it, the first careful step back from the edge he'd been standing on since the moment he'd read his mother's words. Adriana tapped the board twice, hard, drawing both their attention. She'd written one more line while they'd been talking, and now she held it up for her son to see. Listen to her, she is right about you, has been since the beginning. Sandro looked at the words for a long moment, then at Nora. Something passed between them that neither of them said out loud. Didn't need to, not yet, but that settled into the room anyway, quiet and undeniable, the way certain truths do once they've finally been given enough space to exist. That night, long after the house had gone dark, Sandro found himself back in his father's study, standing before the old maps under glass, staring at the harbor his family had spent 3 generations building and one silent woman 3 years surviving to protect. He thought about his father. A man he'd spent his whole life trying to measure up to, without ever fully understanding what the man had actually carried, quietly, until it killed him, a suspicion he could never prove, a wife he couldn't fully protect, a business he'd tried to keep clean in a world built entirely on filth. He thought about Renzo, drowning under a threat aimed at his sister, doing terrible things not out of greed, but out of the same impossible math every desperate person eventually runs. Save the one you love, sacrifice the stranger, and hate yourself either way. He thought about Camille, gone now, exposed and expelled, who he understood now had never actually been the true threat at all. Just the visible edge of something much larger and much older, wearing an engagement ring and a beautiful smile as camouflage. And he thought about Nora. Standing in doorways she had every reason to run from, refusing to lie even with her son's safety on the line. Telling him the truth in that same doorway tonight, plainly, without flattery, without fear of what it might cost her to say it to a man like him. You're also your mother's son. He picked up the folder Whitfield had left him. The Harbor Authority documents, the Halloran Shell Company trail, The slow, patient architecture of a takeover 3 years in the making. And for the first time since this entire nightmare had started with a forgotten phone call, he felt something other than fury settle into his chest. Something colder, steadier, more dangerous in the long run than rage had ever been. A plan. Salvatore Draven had spent 3 years being patient, building his war one quiet document at a time, confident that the Rocca family would never see the whole shape of it until it was far too late to stop. He was about to discover exactly how wrong that confidence had been. Sandro closed the folder, turned off the light, and somewhere out past the cliffs, beyond the fog and the black water and the harbor lights blinking their same tired rhythm they'd blinked for 100 years, a storm that had nothing to do with weather was already beginning to gather. It just hadn't announced itself yet. Give it time. Salvatore Draven did not believe in losing. That was the thing about men who'd spent 40 years building empires out of shipping containers and quiet threats. They didn't experience defeat the way ordinary men did. As an ending, they experienced it as a delay, a miscalculation to be corrected. A number on a ledger that simply hadn't been balanced yet. Word of what happened at the dinner reached him before his own car had cleared the estate gates. Camille sat beside him in the back seat, mascara ruined, ring finger bare, shaking with a fury that had nowhere left to go. Salvatore did not comfort her. He listened, once. All the way through in silence, while the car carried them both away from Halstead Bay. Then once home, he closed his study door, poured himself 2 fings of scotch he didn't drink, and began calmly, methodically to plan. Because that was the difference between Salvatore Draven and every other man foolish enough to cross him. Rage was cheap. Got you a dead man in a war you couldn't win cleanly. Patience was expensive, and patience was exactly what Salvatore had spent 3 decades learning to afford. He'd waited 3 years for the harbor authority seats to fall into place. He could wait a few more weeks for the right moment to make Sandro Rocca understand exactly how large a mistake he'd made. Sandro didn't sleep the week after his mother's confession. Not really. He'd close his eyes somewhere around 3 in the morning and open them again at 5. The same thought waiting for him each time, like a dog that hadn't moved from the foot of the bed all night. His father had suspected. Never proved it, died trying, and Sandro had spent 3 years shaking Salvatore Draven's hand at business functions. Had agreed to marry his daughter. Had let that entire family walk through his front gate, past the guards, into the very room where his mother sat every single day in the silence Salvatore had likely ordered stolen from her. Whitfield's office worked around the clock that week. Sandro paid for it too. Every deal Salvatore Draven had touched in the past decade got pulled apart, thread by thread, until the whole tapestry of the man's empire lay stretched out across 3 conference tables in a locked room. Nobody but Whitfield, Vincent, and Sandro himself had keys to. What they found took Sandro's breath away in a way violence never had. Not one takeover. 2. The harbor authority seats were the visible move. The one meant to be found eventually, once it no longer mattered because the marriage would already have sealed it. But buried 3 shell companies deep in a filing so old it predated Sandro's father's death by less than a year, sat something else entirely.
A debt.
Or what looked like one. Explain this to me again, Sandro said, standing over the table at midnight, sleeves rolled, tie long gone, eyes burning from too many hours reading numbers that refused to add up to anything good. Whitfield adjusted his glasses. According to this filing, your father borrowed $4 million from a Draven-controlled lending entity 11 months before he died. Structured as a private note. Never publicly recorded. No collateral listed except, he tapped the page, a lien against Rocca Harbor Holdings. Specifically the shipping terminal your family has operated for 3 generations. That's not possible, Sandro said. My father never borrowed a cent from that family in his life. I know. Then why does it exist? Whitfield was quiet a moment. The particular quiet of a lawyer choosing his next words with the care of a man diffusing something. Because, he said finally, if that note is real, if it holds up in front of a judge, Salvatore Draven has a legal claim to your family's terminal. Not through marriage. Through debt. And debt doesn't require a wedding to collect on. Sandro sat down. Which meant if it went unanswered, Salvatore didn't need Camille at all anymore. He'd found a second door into the same house. Except this one didn't require a ring on anyone's finger. Is it real? Sandra? Quiet. Almost afraid of the answer. I don't know yet, Whitfield admitted. The signature matches your father's on file. The dates line up. If it's forged, it's the best forgery I've seen in 30 years of practice. And if it's not forged? Whitfield closed the folder, raised slowly. Then your father owed Salvatore Draven $4 million when he died, he said. And nobody in this family has any record of it ever being repaid. Sandro sat with that a long time, the study silent except for the old clock on the mantel, ticking through a night that had somehow impossibly gotten worse than the one that started with a forgotten phone call. Because here it was, the exact trap his father must have feared, must have suspected, must have died trying to outrun. A debt with his signature on it, real or not, that could hand the family's most valuable asset to the very man who had likely ordered his wife silenced, and Sandro had exactly one weapon against it. Which was the one thing Salvatore had always had more of than he did. Nora heard about the note 2 days later, not from Sandro directly, but from the particular quality of silence that had settled over the house since the discovery. The kind of silence that spreads through staff and family alike whenever the man at the top of the household is carrying something too heavy to name out loud at dinner. She found him in the garden at dusk, standing near the koi pond alone, the same spot he'd crouched with Milo weeks, except now his shoulders carried none of that afternoon's ease. Just weight. Visible physical weight, the kind that ages a man in real time if you watch him carry it long enough. "You look like you haven't eaten," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I haven't, that's not sustainable. Neither is losing my family's terminal to a forged debt with my dead father's signature on it," Sandro said, flat, exhausted. "But here we are." Nora absorbed that for a moment. "Tell me, so he did all of it? The shell company, the $4 million. The lien nobody had known existed until Whitfield's team dug 3 layers deeper than anyone had thought to look before." When he finished, Nora was quiet a long moment, staring out at the dark water beyond the cliffs, turning something over. "Your father suspected Salvatore hurt your mother," she said slowly. "Right. Yes, and he never told anyone, never proved it. Just quietly cut off whatever business he'd been doing with that family." "Yes, so what if," Nora said, careful working it out as she spoke, "your father didn't just cut off the business? What if he found proof of something? Something Salvatore couldn't afford to have out in the world? And what if this note, this fake debt, isn't really about money at all? What if it's Salvatore trying to get ahead of something your father was sitting on, something he never got the chance to use before he died?" Sandro turned to look at her, something sharpening behind his eyes. "You think my father had leverage," he said. "Something real. Something that could have exposed Salvatore for what he actually did." "I think it," Tora said. "A man who suspected someone hurt his wife, and never told a soul, doesn't just walk away quietly. Not if he was anything like his son." She held his gaze. "I think he was building something. And I think Salvatore knows it. And I think this fake debt isn't an attack. It's a distraction. Something loud enough to keep you looking the wrong direction while he finds whatever your father actually left behind." Sandro stood very still, the whole shape of the last 2 weeks rearranging itself in his mind.
"At my father's study," said slowly.
"Nothing's been touched since he died."
"Not a single drawer."
"Because you couldn't bring yourself to go through it. Because I told myself there was nothing left to find," he admitted, quiet, almost ashamed of it. "That everything important about him died with him." Nora reached over and took his hand, simple, steady, no hesitation in it now the way there had been weeks earlier. "Let's go find out if that's true," she said. They searched the study together that night, Vincent standing guard at the door, Whitfield summoned back from home despite the late hour, the 4 of them working through drawers and files and old ledgers that hadn't been opened since a funeral 3 years earlier. It was Nora who found it. Not because she was looking harder than the others, but because she was looking differently. Not for a document, but for a place a careful man might hide something he never wanted found by accident. A false bottom. In the drawer beneath the old harbor maps. So shallow it would have passed a casual inspection a dozen times over. Inside a single sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age, and a small leather ledger, handwritten, dates spanning back nearly 4 years. Sandro's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside, a bank confirmation, a wire transfer, $4 million, paid in full, from David Rocca to a Draven holding account, dated 11 months before Sandro's father died. The exact same amount as the fraudulent note. "He paid it," Sandro said, staring at the paper like it might. I looked away. The debt was real. And he paid it off in full. Salvatore's note isn't fake, it's just outdated. Deliberately kept alive after it should have been closed. "Which means," Whitfield said slowly, reading over his shoulder, "Salvatore's entire legal claim collapses the moment we produce this. That's not a lien anymore. That's a paid debt he's illegally trying to resurrect for leverage." But Sandro had already moved past the wire transfer, attention fixed on the small leather ledger beneath it, flipping through pages of his father's careful, cramped handwriting. Dates. Name. Small coded notations that took a moment to parse, and then near the final entries 4 months before his father's death, a single line that made the room go silent around Sandro entirely. Confirmed. D ordered the August incident. Witness secured. Statement pending. August incident, Nora whispered. That's when my mother was attacked, Sandro said, voice barely above a breath. He kept reading the next entry, dated only weeks later. In handwriting slightly less steady than the rest, witness recanted. Threats against family confirmed, proceeding alone. Trust no one until proof is complete. The final entry in the ledger, dated 4 days before his father's fatal heart attack, but they landed in that quiet study like a stone dropped to still water.
This must
Have it.
rush.
For Adriana. For Sandro. Sandro closed the ledger slowly. Sat down. Didn't say anything for a long time. Nora knelt beside his chair, the way she'd knelt beside Adriana's 100 times over the past 6 months, and said nothing either, because some silences didn't need filling. They just needed someone close enough to share the weight of them. He was building the case, Sandro said finally, voice rough. The whole time. Quietly. Alone. Because he didn't trust anyone enough to bring them into it. And he died 4 days before he finished it. He didn't finish it, Nora said gently, but he left you everything you need to. Sandro looked at the ledger in his hands, then at her, something fierce and grieving both moving across his face at once. Then I intend to finish what he started, he said properly. Not with rage, with proof. The proof took another week to assemble properly. Whitfield cross-referencing the ledger's coded entries against actual court and police records, tracking down the recanted witness Sandro's father had mentioned, verifying every claim 3 separate ways before anyone dared present it to a room that would include Salvatore Draven himself. Because that was the plan Sandro had settled on. Not a quiet confrontation. Not a private reckoning behind closed doors, where Salvatore could simply deny everything and disappear behind another shell company. A public. The Harbor Authority's annual gala, 3 weeks out, hosted every year at the Halstead Bay Maritime Club, the one event where every family with a stake in the port, Rocca and Draven, and half a dozen smaller houses besides, gathered under the same roof, in front of the same witnesses, the same reporters, the same board members whose votes actually mattered. You want to do this there, Whitfield said when Sandro first proposed it. In front of everyone. I want Salvatore to understand, Sandro said, that whatever he does next, he does it in front of exactly the audience he spent 3 years trying to control. No shadows left for him to retreat into. That's a significant risk. So was letting a woman threaten my mother's caregiver's son under my own roof, Sandro said. I've stopped being interested in the safe version of anything. Renzo, in the weeks that followed, became something he had not expected to become. When Sandro first offered him that impossible bargain in the equipment room, useful, genuinely, willingly useful in a way that surprised even Vincent, who had spent 11 years assumes about most people and rarely being disappointed by that assumption. Salvatore, still believing his mole remained loyal and undiscovered, kept feeding Renzo instructions, small requests at first testing, then larger ones as confidence returned. Watch the new security rotation. Report on Rocca's schedule. Find out what Nora Bennett knows and how close she's gotten to the family. Renzo reported all of it back to Vincent in real time, word for word, which meant that for the first time since this entire nightmare had started, Sandro Rocca had something he'd never had before against Salvatore Draven. A window into the man's own plans, delivered fresh, before Salvatore even knew the window had been opened from both sides. He wants to know if Nora's still close to the family, Renzo reported one evening, standing in the same equipment room, voice steadier now than it had been in weeks. Specifically whether she's likely to be believed if she testifies against Camille's threat in any formal capacity. What did you tell him? Vincent asked. That she's isolated. Uncertain. Vulnerable. Renzo's jaw tautened. That she'd be an easy target if pressure needed applying somewhere quiet, away from the house. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very cold. And what does he plan to do with that information? I don't know yet, Renzo admitted. But I know what men like Salvatore do when they think a woman is isolated and easy to pressure. I've seen it before. Different woman, different city. Same playbook. Vincent was already reaching for his phone. Then we make sure, he said, that Nora Bennett is never, at any point in the next 3 weeks, actually alone. Nora didn't know, in those weeks, exactly how much danger still circled her. Sandro had made the decision, deliberately, to keep the worst of it from her, not out of any desire to control what she knew, but out of something closer to the exact opposite instinct. He wanted her to have one part of her life that still felt like her own. So she spent her days the way she had for months. Caring for Adriana. Ferrying Milo to and from school, though always now with an unmarked car trailing at a discreet, careful distance, driven by men she'd stopped noticing weeks ago because they'd simply become part of the landscape of her life. The way weather becomes part of a place you've lived long enough. She didn't know about the ledger yet, not the full weight of it. Didn't know about the leverage Sandro was quietly assembling, piece by careful piece, for a confrontation 3 weeks out that would either end the Draven family's grip on Halstead Bay entirely, or hand them everything they'd spent 3 years scheming to take. What she did know, with increasing and uncomfortable clarity, was that something had shifted between her and Sandro that she no longer had the ability to pretend away. It showed up in small things. The way he found reasons to be in the East Wing when she was tending to Adriana. Reasons that grew progressively thinner and less convincing each time. The way Milo had started, without any prompting from her, referring to him simply as Sandro instead of the mafia boss, a small linguistic shift that meant more than either adult in the situation wanted to examine too closely. The way one evening in early autumn, Sandro had appeared at her cottage door in the rain soaked through, refusing to come inside until she opened the door herself. You could have just knocked and waited under the porch, she'd told him, exasperated, water pooling at his feet on her welcome mat. I did knock 20 minutes ago. I wanted to give you time to decide, he'd said. Simple, unadorned, the honesty of it landing harder than any grand gesture could have. If you didn't want me here, I intended to leave before you had to tell me so. She'd let him in. They hadn't talked about anything important that night. Just sat at her small kitchen table while Milo slept in the next room, drinking tea that went cold between them, talking about nothing in particular. His father's old boat. Her sister's laugh. The specific way Halstead Bay smelled different in autumn than in summer. It should have felt strange. A mafia boss and a caregiver sitting at a chipped kitchen table in a cottage that could fit inside his study twice over. It didn't feel strange at all, it felt, unsettlingly, like the first ordinary thing either of them had experienced in months. The gala arrived on a clear October evening, cold enough for coats. The harbor lit up gold and silver against a sky finally mercifully free of the gray fog that had haunted Halstead Bay for weeks. The Maritime Club sat on its own private pier, glass walls looking out over black water, chandeliers throwing warm light across 200 guests who had no idea walking in that they were about to witness the end of a 3-year war. Most of them didn't even know had been quietly underway. Nora wore the dark green dress again. Sandro had asked her to, quietly the week before, in a request that carried more weight than either of them said out loud. Because it isn't just a dress anymore, she thought, standing in front of the mirror before they left. Because it's the dress from the night everything changed. Which means wearing it again means something. Which means he does that. Which means he wants me there, standing beside him, when whatever happens tonight happens. She didn't finish that thought either. She just went downstairs, took Sandro's offered arm, and let him lead her into a room full of people who would, within the hour, watch an empire begin to fall. Salvatore Draven arrived 20 minutes later, silver cane in hand, Camille conspicuously absent, sent away somewhere, rumor said, though nobody seemed entirely sure where, and Salvatore volunteered nothing. He crossed the room toward Sandro with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who believed, still, despite everything, that he held the better hand. Sandro, he said, extending a hand Sandro did not take. No hard feelings, I hope. Family business gets complicated. My daughter's temperament aside, I trust we can still find our way to a productive arrangement. I received your note, Sandro said. Calm level. The $4 million lien against my terminal. Something flickered in Salto's eyes, brief, controlled, but there. Ah. Yes. Unfortunate business that. Your father's debts don't simply vanish, because he's no longer here to honor them. No, Sandro agreed. They don't, which is why I appreciate you raising it tonight. In front of everyone who matters to this decision. Salvatore's smile tightened by a fraction of a degree. I wasn't aware, he said carefully, that we were to discuss this public. We're not discussing anything yet, Sandro said. I'm simply telling you that I intend to. He turned, raised a hand, and across the room, near the small stage usually reserved for the evening's Harbor Authority remarks, Whitfield stepped forward with a leather portfolio under one arm. The room's low hum of conversation began gradually to quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, Sandro said, his voice carrying easily across the glass-walled room without needing to be raised. The particular authority of a man who had learned long ago that volume was rarely necessary, when people were already listening for other reasons. Forgive the interruption to the evening's usual proceedings. There's a matter of some importance to this harbor's future that I believe deserves everyone's attention tonight, rather than a quiet room somewhere later. Salvatore's expression had gone carefully neutral, the mask of a man recalculating in real time. 3 weeks ago, Sandro continued, I received notice of a private lending note, allegedly signed by my father, claiming an outstanding $4 million debt against my family's terminal holdings. The note was structured through a Draven-controlled lending entity. It was never publicly recorded, and it was presented to me quietly, at a moment when my family's public standing had just been considerably weakened by a broken engagement. A murmur moved through the crowd. Salvatore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I want to be very clear, Sandro said, about what that note actually represents. He nodded to Whitfield, who opened the leather portfolio and held up a single document, enlarged, projected now onto the screen usually reserved for harbor traffic statistics, a wire transfer confirmation. $4 million. David Rocca to Draven Holdings. Paid in full 11 months before Sandro's father's death. My father paid this debt, Sandro said, in full nearly 4 years ago. The note presented to me 3 weeks ago was not a legitimate outstanding claim. It was a resurrected document, deliberately kept alive well past its actual expiration, in an attempt to seize legal control of Rocca Harbor Holdings under false pretenses. Stepped forward, composure cracking now at the edges. This is a private business matter, he said, voice tight. Not appropriate for a public gathering, I agree, Sandro said. Which is exactly why I find it interesting that you chose to send it privately, rather than through any legitimate channel. 3 weeks before this exact gathering. Almost as though you hoped it would be resolved quietly, before anyone here had the chance to ask why a paid debt suddenly reappeared. The room had gone fully silent now. 200 guests watching a war they hadn't known existed suddenly to become visible in real time. Sandro nodded again to Whitfield, who produced a second document. There is a further matter, Sandro said. And here, for the first time all evening, something harder entered his voice. Something that had nothing to do with money or terminals or legal claims. One considerably more serious than fraudulent paperwork. Salvatore's face had gone pale. 3 years ago, Sandro said, my mother was attacked outside this very harbor. She survived. She lost the ability to speak. For 3 years my family believed this was a random act of violence. He let the silence stretch, let it do its own work. It wasn't. Whitfield held up a photograph of a handwritten page. A page from the leather ledger, David Rocca's careful, cramped handwriting enlarged for the whole room to see. Confirmed SD ordered the August incident. A collective intake of breath moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. My father spent the final months of his life quietly building proof of exactly who ordered that attack, and exactly why, Sandro said. He died 4 days before he finished. I found his notes 3 weeks ago. Along with a witness statement, recanted under duress at the time, that my legal team has since confirmed independently through separate corroborating testimony. Salvatore's hands had begun, very slightly, to shake around the head of his silver cane. You have no proof of any of this, he said, voice rising for the first time, control finally slipping in front of the exact audience he'd spent 3 years trying to command. Fabricated ledgers. Coerced witnesses. This is exactly the kind of theater a desperate man produces when he's about to lose everything. Perhaps, Sandro said. Or perhaps it's exactly the kind of proof a patient man produces, when he's finally certain enough to stop being quiet about it. He turned to address the room fully now, voice steady, carrying. I'm not here tonight to ask this board to take my word for anything, he said. I'm here to submit everything I've described. The fraudulent note, the wire transfer proving it was paid, my father's ledger, and the witness statement to independent legal review, effective immediately. I will submit to any investigation this board deems appropriate. I ask only that Salvatore Draven be held to the same standard. Salvatore looked around the room and for the first time in longer than most of the people present had known him, looked genuinely uncertain of his footing, because here was the thing he hadn't accounted for, hadn't built into 3 years of patient careful planning. He had assumed Sandro Rocca would fight the way his father had, quietly, carefully, alone, unwilling to risk public exposure of a wound that ran this deep. He had not accounted for a son willing to drag his own family's grief into the light publicly, deliberately, specifically because the light was the one thing Salvatore Draven had never learned to survive. This is slander, Salvatore said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty entirely. I'll have my lawyers. I'd welcome that, Sandro said. I imagine they'll have questions about the Shelth Company financing 3 separate Halloran shipping loans over the past 6 years as well. Since we're already discussing transparency tonight. The room's murmur turned into something closer to a roar. Salvatore Draven stood very still in the center of it, silver cane gripped white-knuckled, and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives once it's already far too late, that the 3 years of patient architecture he'd built his entire endgame upon had just collapsed in front of the exact audience he'd spent all that time trying to control. He left the gala within the hour. Didn't wait for the board's formal response. didn't stay to see the Harbor Authority chairman announce, visibly shaken, that an independent review would begin immediately, or watch the Halloran family's representative quietly excuse himself from the room, phone already pressed to his ear. He simply left, cane tapping sharp against marble, face a mask of controlled fury that fooled absolutely no one who'd watched the previous 20 minutes unfold. Nora watched him go from across the room, standing close enough to Sandro that their shoulders nearly touched, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Is it over? She asked quietly. Sandro watched the doors close behind Salvatore's retreating figure, something grim settling into his expression that told her, even before he answered, that the honest response wasn't the reassuring one. No, he said. Men like Salvatore don't accept an ending like this quietly. This isn't over. This is the moment he stops being careful. Nora's stomach tightened. What does that mean? Sandro turned to look at her, and for just a moment, something raw and afraid moved behind his composed expression. Not for himself, she understood immediately, but for her. It means, he said, I need you and Milo somewhere I can watch every single road leading to it. Starting tonight, Salvatore did not go home quietly. He sat alone in the back of his own car, watching the harbor lights blur past through rain that had started again somewhere over the water, and felt something inside him that he had not felt in 3 decades of careful, patient business. Fear. Not of Sandro Rocca directly. Salvatore had faced down more dangerous men than that in his time. Men who solved disagreements with methods considerably less civilized than a ledger presented at a gala. What frightened him was the review. The independent investigation, already set in motion, that would pull apart every shell company, every Halloran loan, every carefully constructed layer of deniability he'd spent 30 years building around himself. Because once investigators started pulling threads, they rarely stopped at the first one. And buried somewhere beneath the Harbor Authority scheme, beneath the fraudulent debt note, sat the one thing Salvatore had spent 3 years making absolutely certain nobody would ever find. The truth about what happened to Adriana Rocca. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he had not called directly in over a year, always preferring the safer distance of intermediaries, shell accounts, men like Renzo who could be threatened into carrying his instructions without ever knowing whose voice truly stood behind them. Tonight distance felt like a luxury he no longer had time for. It's unraveling, he said the moment the call connected, faster than we planned for. A pause. A voice on the other end, low, unbothered. Then we stop planning, the voice said, and start finishing. What do you mean? I mean, the voice said that Rocca has exactly one weakness left standing closest enough to reach the caregiver. Take her off the board and he stops thinking clearly. Grief does that to men like him. It did it to his father. Salvatore was quiet a long moment, staring out at the rain-streaked window, the harbor sliding past dark and indifferent. She's protected, he said finally. Rocca's had guards on her for weeks. Guards fail, the voice said. Especially when they're following a schedule someone inside the house has already handed us. Salvatore closed his eyes. Renzo, of course. He still believed the man remained loyal. Still terrified into obedience by the fate of his sister's restaurant. Still feeding information back through the same channel that had worked flawlessly for the better part of a year. He had no way of knowing, sitting in that rain-slicked car, that the channel had been compromised for weeks. That every piece of information he believed he was had in fact been carefully, deliberately fed to him in reverse. Do it, Salvatore said. Tomorrow on the coastal road away from the estate. Make it look like an accident if you can, a message if you can't. He ended the call. And 3 miles away, in a small equipment room lit by a single bare bulb, Vincent listened to a recording of that exact conversation for the second time. Jaw tight, already reaching for his phone to wake Sandro from whatever little sleep he'd managed to find that night. They're going to move on Nora. Vincent said. The moment Sandro answered, no softening. Sandro was upright before the sentence finished when. Tomorrow. Coastal road, away from the estate. Vincent's voice was flat, controlled, the particular calm of a man who had trained himself for exactly this kind of moment and hated every second of needing that training now. Renzo's channel finally paid off. Salvatore thinks we're still blind. Does Nora have plans to leave the estate tomorrow? School run, Vincent said. Milo's pickup. Same time, same route she's used for months. Sandro was always pulling on a Shimmerat phone pressed to his ear, mind moving faster than his hands changed the route. If we change it too obviously, Salvatore's people notice, and we lose the chance to catch them in the act instead of just avoiding them once. This could be our best chance to end this permanently. I don't care about ending this permanently, Sandro said, voice sharp enough that Vincent went quiet on the other end. I care about Nora being alive tomorrow night. A pause. Understood, Vincent said finally. Then here's what I'd suggest instead. Nora insisted on driving herself the next morning, the way she'd insisted on most mornings for the past 6 months. A small stubborn habit that had, until now, seemed harmless enough for Sandro to allow without much argument. Today it terrified him. I don't like it, he said, standing in the mansion's front hall as she gathered her keys. Milo already waiting in the car with the patient, unbothered posture of a child who had learned, over the past few weeks, that adults in this house occasionally had urgent private conversations he was better off not overhearing. You never like it, Nora said not unkindly. You've never liked it since the day I got here. This is different. Everything's always different. She softened, seeing something in his face that told her this wasn't the usual overprotective instinct she'd learned to gently push back against Sandro. What's actually going on? He hesitated. Weeks of deliberately keeping the worst of it from her ward, visibly, against the simple fact that lying to her right now felt like a betrayal larger than any comfort it might buy. There's a credible threat, he said finally. Against you. Today. Nora's blood went cold. Milo is safer, Sandro said immediately. He's not in the car with you when it happens. I need you to drop him at the guest suite first. Vincent's already arranged it. Rosa's expecting him when what happens. An escort's following you. 3 cars back. The entire route, Sandro. You won't see them. That's the point. If anything happens, they're close enough to reach you in under a minute. Nora's head started to shake, the old fear rising fast and familiar. Why not just cancel the route entirely? Why not just keep us here, safe behind the gates? Because Salvatore Draven needs to believe one more time that he still has an opening, Sandro said. And the moment he acts on that belief, in front of witnesses, on a public road, is the moment this ends. Permanently, legally. Without ambiguity, anyone can argue away in a courtroom later. You're using me as bait. I'm using an opportunity he's already decided to create, Sandro said. And something in his voice cracked slightly around the edges. Something that told her exactly how much this decision was costing him to say out loud. I would give anything for it not to have to be you, but it is you. And I intend to make absolutely certain nothing happens to you today that I can't undo. Nora looked at him a long moment, fear and fury and something else entirely warring in her chest all at once. If anything happens to me, she said finally quiet, you make sure Milo never finds out the real reason for it. You let him believe I was just careless, not that I was used. Nothing is going to happen to you. Promise me anyway, Sandro's jaw tightened. I promise. She left 10 minutes later. Milo dropped safely at the guest suite exactly as planned. The drive to school uneventful, ordinary, almost disappointingly normal given the weight sitting in her chest the entire way. It was the drive back that went wrong. Her car stalled on the narrow coastal road just past the second turn, the exact spot where the shoulder narrowed to almost nothing and a steep drop fell away toward gray rocks and grayer water below. A natural stall. She understood that immediately, some instincts sharpened by months of low-grade fear finally recognizing the difference between bad luck and bad intent. The engine hadn't sputtered. It had simply, completely died. The way engines die when someone has tampered with them beforehand and timed the fail for a specific stretch of road. 2 black SUVs pulled into position within one ahead, not Rocca vehicles. She knew that instantly, 2 different make, different plates, and a wrongness in the way the men who stepped out of them moved. Unhurried, confident, the posture of men who believed, completely, that they'd already won. Nora's hands found the door locks before her brain fully caught up with what was happening. Some deep animal instinct taking over the moment, conscious thought stuttered under the weight of pure fear. Her phone was already ringing before she'd finished locking every door. Sandro. Don't hang up, he said, the instant she answered. Voice tight, controlled, moving fast in the background behind him. How did your escort stopped responding 4 minutes ago? I've had eyes on your position since. Pause. Nora, listen to me very carefully. A man approached her window, tapped the glass once, casual, almost bored, the barrel of something metallic catching the gray afternoon light. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Nora, Sandro said, voice sharp, urgent, steadying itself by sheer will the instant it left his mouth. Look at me. What? Not at him. The rearview mirror. Look. She looked far behind the black SUV blocking the road. Headlights had begun cutting through the mist. Fast, many Rocca vehicles. She understood immediately. The specific formation Vincent's men always drove in, closing the distance at a speed that should have terrified her, and instead, impossibly, made something in her chest loosen just slightly. Unlock nothing, Sandro said, voice low, steady, the exact opposite of the panic clawing up her own throat. Say nothing when I tell you. Get down, the man at her window shouted something she couldn't hear over her own heartbeat. Now Sandro said. She dropped. The world exploded into motion around her, engines roaring, doors slamming, men shouting overlapping instructions she couldn't parse, tires screaming against wet pavement close enough to do through the car's frame. Something struck the driver's side window with a crack that didn't shatter it, but sent a spiderweb of fractures blooming across the glass 6 inches from where her head had been a second earlier. Nora curled into the footwell, both hands over her head, breathing in short, desperate gasps that felt less like breathing and more like a body trying frantically to keep a soul inside it by sheer force of will. Because this is it. Because this is the exact thing every mother fears without ever letting herself say out loud. Except it's not Milo. Which should feel like relief and doesn't. Which just feels like a different kind of terror. The kind where you realize your own life was never actually separate from his safety at all. Not really. Because if something happens to you out here on this road, who tells him? Who explains it? Who's left to hold him while he cries? The car door wrenched open. She screamed, swung blindly, once fist contacting with something solid before a hand caught her wrist, gentle even in its urgency. Nora. She looked up. He stood in the open doorway, rain and mist silvering his black coat, and his eyes, usually so controlled, so carefully composed, had gone wide with something she'd never once seen on his face before. Not rage. Fear. You're here, he said, and the words came out rough, almost broken, like they'd cost him something enormous to say out loud in front of the men still handling the wreckage of the ambush behind them. You're here, you're safe. She stared at him, shaking too hard to answer, and watched his gaze move over her face, her shoulders, her hands, checking for injury with a controlled panic that betrayed him more completely than any spoken confession could have managed. Then slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, he reached for her. She didn't refuse. Sandro lifted her out of the car like she weighed nothing at all, though she had spent her entire life being made to feel too much, too big, too heavy, too inconvenient, too hard to love, and for one strange, suspended second, held in his arms with the world still shouting and scrambling around them. She felt none of that. She felt held, which frightened her, in that moment considerably more than the men on the road ever had. He carried her to his own vehicle while Vincent's men handled the aftermath behind them. The 2 black SUVs as Sadri surrounded, the men who'd approached her window face down on wet pavement, cuffed, contained, one of them already talking rapidly to whoever would listen in exchange for a lighter outcome later. Nora didn't look back. She had no desire in that moment to see the exact cost of what it meant to be protected by a man like Sandro Rocca. Inside the SUV, he wrapped his own coat around her shoulders, hands not quite steady, a fact she noticed with a strange distant clarity given everything else happening in her body at that moment. You disobeyed me, he said. Her laugh came out broken, half sob. I'm sorry. Was I supposed to thank you for Urchezit's guards behind my back? Yes. Despite everything, something in her almost smiled. Then her face crumpled entirely. The adrenaline finally draining out and leaving nothing behind but the raw shaking terror it had been holding at bay. Sandro moved closer, then stopped himself abruptly. The same careful restraint he'd shown her weeks ago outside her cottage door in the rain. That restraint undid her more than anything else could have. I hate this, she whispered. I hate your world. I hate that Milo needs his guard. I hate that your enemies know my name, I know. And I hate, she said, voice breaking further, that I feel safer when you're near me. That's the part I actually hate the most. Sandro went very outside. Rain began again, soft against the roof. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence stretching thick, with everything neither of them had let themselves say out loud, until a man had put a gun to a car window, and forced the truth up out of both of them at once. You should not feel that way,
Sandro said finally.
Voice low. I'm not a safe man. No, Nora said, looking at him through tears she'd stopped trying to hide. But you're becoming safe to me. That's the actual problem. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then Sandro reached out and brushed one tear from her cheek with his thumb, not possessive, not claiming. Something closer to reverent. The careful touch of a man handling something he understood, finally, completely, that he could break if he wasn't extraordinarily careful. Nora, he said, and her name sounded dangerous in his mouth precisely because of how gently he said it. The driver's door opened, the moment broke the way moments always seem to break in this house, at exactly the wrong instant. But after that day, something between them had shifted permanently, and neither of them tried very hard to pretend otherwise anymore. The formal collapse of Salvatore Draven's empire took another 6 weeks to complete, though the ambush on the coastal road turned out to be the single fastest moving thread in the entire unraveling. Because attempted kidnapping, caught on Vincent's own dashboard cameras, corroborated by two of the men involved who flipped within hours of being processed, desperate to avoid the considerably harsher alternative of facing Salvatore's own retribution for failure, gave prosecutors something considerably more concrete than fraudulent business ledgers to work with. One of the captured men, a mid-level enforcer named Delgado who had worked Draven jobs for the better part of a decade, gave a full statement within 48 hours, trading testimony for a plea deal his own lawyer had negotiated before Salvatore's people even realized he was talking. And Delgado, it turned out, had been present for more than just the attempted ambush. He'd been present 3 years earlier on the night Adriana Rocca was attacked. He wasn't the one who did it, Whitfield explained to Sandro and Nora, gathered once again in the study beneath the old harbor maps, 3 weeks after the coastal road. But he drove the car. He confirms everything your father's ledger suspected. Ordered directly by Salvatore. A warning exactly as your father wrote, mean to stop him from ending the business relationship. Sandro sat with that a long moment, something in his chest finally quietly settling into place after 3 years of unresolved grief that had never had a name to attach itself to. Will he testify, he asked. He's already agreed to, Whitfield said, in exchange for reduced charges on his own involvement. Combined with the fraudulent note, the Harbor Authority financing scheme, and now a confirmed order for a violent attack against a private citizen, he paused, choosing his next words carefully. Sandro, this isn't a business dispute anymore. This is a criminal case. A serious one. Salvatore Draven is not walking away from Thenenizlin's empire intact. Possibly not walking away from it at all. Nora reached over and took Sandro's hand, quiet, steady, the way she'd done a dozen times now in this exact room. Your father would be proud, she said softly, of how you finished it. Sandro was quiet a moment, looking down at the ledger sitting closed on the desk between them, at the careful cramped handwriting of a man who had died 4 days short of finishing what his son had just finally completed. He'd be prouder, Sandro said, that I didn't finish it alone. Salvatore Draven was arrested 11 days later, at his own estate, in front of the same iron gates that had once seemed as permanent and untouchable as anything in Halstead Bay. Camille, it emerged, had fled the state weeks earlier quietly, without contesting the broken engagement or the recording that had ended it. Her family's collapse apparently sufficient warning that whatever came next was not a fight worth staying to lose in premier. The Harbor Authority Board voted, unanimously, 3 weeks after the gala, to remove the Halloran seat entirely pending a full investigation into the shell company financing, and to formally table any further discussion of consolidation between the Rocca and Draven interests until the criminal proceedings concluded. In practice, everyone in that room understood exactly what the vote meant. The Draven family's grip on Halstead Bay, 3 years in the careful, patient building, had ended in less seasons, undone not by violence or vengeance, but by a ledger a dying man had left behind for son he'd never gotten the chance to fully explain it to. The months that followed moved slower than anything else in this whole ordeal had. Legal proceedings, Whitfield reminded them more than once, don't collapse in an evening the way a dinner party does. There were depositions, continuances, a grand jury that took its time. Sandro attended what he had to attend, testified where his testimony mattered, and otherwise let the machinery of the courts do the long, unglamorous work that no gala confrontation, however dramatic, could substitute for. Halstead Bay, for its part, moved on the way towns like it always do, quietly over dinner tables and church pews. The Draven name spoken less and less, until it became something people mentioned, only when they were explaining why the Harbor Authority looked different now than it had the year before. Adriana received the news of Salvatore's arrest the same way she received most things now. Quietly from her chair by the window, writing board resting in lap while Nora read the details aloud from Whitfield's formal summary. When Nora finished, Adriana sat very still for a long moment, staring out at the gray Atlantic, and Nora couldn't quite read what moved behind her eyes. Relief certainly, but something else too, something heavier, 3 years of carried grief finally finding somewhere to set itself down. Slowly Adriana lifted the pen, wrote one word. Then after a moment another line beneath it. David can rest. Nora's eyes filled. She reached out and took the older woman's trembling hand, holding it the way she'd held it through so many difficult nights over the past months, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them, warm now instead of frightened, settled instead of waiting. Finally, Adriana tapped the board but then wrote one more thing, and this one made Nora's breath catch entirely. Now, my turn to fix something. What do you mean? Nora asked. Adriana's eyes lifted to hers, something fierce and warm and entirely certain moving behind them. She didn't answer. Not. She simply squeezed Nora's hand once, tapped the board twice more, and turned back toward the window, a small, satisfied smile settling over features that had, for 3 long years, rarely had reason to wear one. The dinner Adriana requested came together on a Friday evening in late November, nearly 7 months after the night Camille Draven's own recorded voice had ended one engagement and, though nobody had understood it fully at the time, begun an entirely different story instead. Not an engagement dinner, not a business function, not a performance for board members or rival families as anyone whose approval mattered to the Harbor Authority. Just family. Milo sat beside Adriana, with the serious, self-appointed gravity of a boy who had decided, somewhere over the past few months, that he was officially her translator in training, regardless of whether anyone had asked him to be. She wants more bread, Milo announced at one point, watching Adriana tap the board with visible amusement in her eyes. I'm getting really good at this, you're guessing, Nora said. I'm guessing correctly, which is basically the same thing as being good at it. Adriana tapped twice, hard, and Milo grinned like he'd just won an argument in court. Rosa brought considerably more food than 4 people could reasonably eat, the way Rosa always did when she was happy about something and hadn't quite figured out how else to express it. Sandro sat at the head of the table, and for the first times in longer than Nora had known him, the chair didn't seem to make him look lonely at all. Near dessert, Adriana set her palm flat against the table. Everyone stopped. She pointed toward her writing board. Nora reached to hand it over, but Adriana shook her head slightly and instead pushed the pen toward Sandro first.
Mama.
She tapped twice. Then pointed, deliberately, unmistakably, to the empty chair beside him, and then to Nora. Nora's heart began to pound. Adriana, she whispered. The old woman ignored her entirely and began slowly to write. Her hand shook, the way it always did, but steadier now than it had been on that terrible night many months earlier, as though something in her had healed alongside everything else that had finally been set right. I want my son to marry Nora. If Nora chooses him freely. The room went completely still. Milo's eyes had gone wide. Rose, standing near the doorway with a serving dish still in her hands, actually crossed herself. Sandro didn't move for a long moment, gaze fixed on his mother's careful handwriting. Mama, he said again, quieter this time. Adriana wrote further, unhurried now, each word deliberate. Not servant, not debt. Nora's face had gone hot, her throat tight with something too large to easily name. I can't, she started. Sandro stood slowly. He didn't move closer. Not yet. That distance, Nora would think, nearly undid her more completely than any sudden gesture could have. Nora, he said quietly. You don't have to answer anything tonight. Tears filled her eyes despite every effort to hold them back. Of course he'd say exactly the one thing that made it impossible for her to simply walk away from the moment. For years, men in her life had wanted answers from her. Commitments, sacrifices, gratitude, forgiveness, always some smaller version of herself handed over in exchange for something that never quite matched the cost. Sandro was offering her space instead, which somehow made it entirely impossible to refuse. Adriana pushed the board toward her. There was underlined beneath the first, and this one, when Nora read it, made her breath catch completely. My son needs a woman who tells him the truth. Nora needs a man who will never ask her to abandon her son. Small face, son serious. Mom, he said. Is Nana Adriana asking if Sandro can be my dad? The room broke softly, half laughter, half tears, the tension of the moment dissolving into something warmer and messier and entirely more human. Nora covered her mouth, caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Sandro looked at Milo, really looked at him, the way he'd looked at him that afternoon by the koi pond, except with something new underneath it now, something that looked almost frightened. The feared Sandro Rocca, visibly nervous in front of a 9-year-old boy's answer. Only if your mother wants that, Sandro said carefully. And only if you do too. Milo considered this with the grave seriousness of a much older negotiator. Fork paused halfway to his mouth. Would I have to wear black all the time? No. Would Mom still be allowed to tell you when you're wrong? She already does that regularly, Sandro said without waiting for permission. Would Nana Adriana live with us? Adriana tapped the board so hard it jumped against the table. Twice. Milo nodded, businesslike, as though closing a particularly satisfying deal. Okay, he said. Then maybe it's fine. Everyone laughed through tears at once. Sandro's gaze found Nora's across the table. No command in it. No expectation. Nothing but a man feared across 3 states standing before the one-person answer he genuinely could not compel, and had no interest in compelling even if he could have. I won't pretend I deserve you, he said, quiet, steady. Because my mother says so. I won't pretend my world is simple. It isn't. I have enemies, I have sins, I carry a name people fear for reasons that are entirely earned. Nora's tears slipped free, unstoppable now. But I know this, Sandro continued. I don't want you because you saved my mother. I don't want you because I owe you anything. I want you because when everyone else in this house saw silence, you heard a woman. When everyone else saw a servant, you stood like a mother defending her child. When I saw only power, you showed me responsibility. And instead, his voice dropped lower. You saw my mother, you saw Mal, and somehow when I deserved it least, you saw me too. Nora couldn't look away from him. And if one day, he said, not because of gratitude, not because my mother wishes it, but because you choose it. If one day you can imagine a life beside me, I will spend the rest of mine making certain neither you nor your son ever stands alone again. No one in the room spoke, even the candles seemed to hold still. Nora looked at Adriana, the woman who had lost her voice but never once her will, who had spent 3 years surviving silently to spend it now, deliberately on this one moment. She looked at Milo, the boy she had chosen, over every easier path life had offered her. Then finally, she looked at Sandro, the dangerous man who had learned over the course of one impossible year that love without listening was only ever another shape of pride. I spent years, she said slowly, refusing any love that asked me to give up my son. I would never ask that of you. And I won't enter this house as charity, she said. Never that, you wouldn't be. And I won't be owned, she said. Voice steadier now. Not by anyone. Something fear moved behind his eyes said. If you say yes, it comes with truth. With Milo, with Adriana. With nothing kept hidden or moved out of your reach ever again. Sandro stepped closer slowly enough that she had every chance to stop him. She did. Then say yes, he said, only if you want me. Nora's hands trembled. Adriana watched with tears openly falling now, no longer bothering to hide them. Milo slipped his small hand quietly into hers, a 9-year-old's version of steady support offered without a single word needed to explain it. Nora took one long breath. Not one day, she whispered. Tonight. Sandro's face changed entirely, not with victory, but with something closer. To looked almost sate to witness Nara. Yes, she said, slowly, honestly, each word arriving steadier than the last. Yes. Adriana tapped the board twice, then again, and again, until the whole table was laughing through tears at once, and Sandro crossed the last of the distance between them and took Nora's hand like a man receiving something sacred rather than something owed. He lifted her fingers to his lips, kissed them softly, and Milo groaned theatrically from his chair. Do I have to watch this? Adriana tapped once. No, she pointed instead with unmistakable amusement toward his abandoned slice of cake. He happily obeyed.
The wedding took
place the following spring. In the garden behind the Rocca estate, the Atlantic shining a clean, generous blue beyond the cliffs for the first time in longer than anyone present could quite remember. Roses moving softly in a breeze that carried none of the old fog with it. There were no false alliances gathered under those white columns that day. No hungry families measuring the marble for future advantage. No woman in ivory silk pretending love was simply another form of ownership dressed up in expensive fabric. Only people who had actually earned their place there. Rosa cried openly into a handkerchief she'd clearly brought specifically for the purpose. Vincent stood at the edge of the gathered guests, arms crossed in his usual watchful posture, suspiciously bright-eyed despite his best efforts to disguise it. Renzo stood a respectful distance back, his sister's restaurant safe now, quietly, permanent thanks Sandro had made months earlier and never once brought up again. A debt repaid not in words but in the simple fact of a man finally sleeping through the night without fear for someone he loved. Milo stood proudly at the front, holding Adriana's writing board like it was some kind of ceremonial document of enormous importance, which in its own way it absolutely was. And Adriana herself sat in her chair near the front, dressed as soft blue, the small silver cross at her throat catching the spring sunlight, watching her son marry a woman who had walked through the servants' gate many months earlier with a second-hand purse and a rezusti folded too carefully in her hand, and had somehow quietly, without ever asking anyone's permission, become the loudest voice this entire family had. When the officiant asked, at the appropriate moment, whether anyone present wished to offer a blessing, Adriana lifted her board, her hand moved slowly, but every word this time came through clear and unmistakable. Family is who protects your voice when the world refuses to hear it. Sandro bowed his head. Nora, standing beside him in white now instead of borrowed green, reached down and took Milo's hand. Adriana tapped the board twice. Yes. And that, in the end, was how Nora Bennett, the plus-size caregiver who had walked into a dangerous house to protect another woman's silenced voice, finally found her own. Not because the danger had entirely vanished from the world around her. It hadn't, not completely, Not in a life that would always carry Sandro's name and everything that came attached to it. Not because the world he lived in had somehow become gentle. It hadn't and never fully would. Not because love on its own had managed to erase every wound either of them carried into that garden. But because a silent mother had refused, after 3 long years, to remain powerless in her own home. Because a frightened woman had chosen truth over the much easier comfort of fear. On a rainy afternoon that had nearly cost her everything. Because a small boy had reminded every adult around him, without ever meaning to, exactly what courage was actually for. And because a man feared across an entire coastline had finally learned that the strongest voice in his empire had never once needed to shout to be heard. Salvatore Draven had believed, for 3 long years, that silence meant weakness. He had been wrong. Sassets in that house had simply been watching. Silence had been waiting, and when it finally spoke, it changed absolutely everything.